Let me open up by saying welcome to the 20th Annual American Democracy Conference sponsored by the UVA Center for Politics. Hard to believe it's been 20 years, feels more like 40, but a lot's happened in those 20 years, and we've enjoyed doing this annually and having the opportunity to chew a bit about the last election and to project forward into the new election. We have tried to assemble political insiders, both those in office, pollsters, journalists, party representatives, strategists, to do this, and I think you'll see a lot of that today. We're looking forward to the panels that we put together, but we're particularly looking forward to our first speaker, and we want to also thank the students from local areas who have come out to be here today. I think your teachers encouraged you to come. Our core mission is civic education and civic participation, and this is part of our mission. So anyway, let me introduce Congressman Adam Schiff, who represents California's 28th Congressional District and was just elected to his 10th term in the House. And it's going to be a very special term since Democrats have a substantial majority, and he is going to be the incoming chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. He's currently the ranking member, of course, and this is a critical committee, especially during this very unusual administration. And we'll be talking a little bit about that during our Q&A session to come up with. Before Congress, he was a California state senator. He's a graduate of Stanford and Harvard law schools. He didn't need any safety schools for the students here. They had nothing to worry about. And we're just delighted he could spare a little bit of time for us today. So if those coming in would quickly take their seats, we're going to begin right now. Congressman, would you come out, please? Thank you so much for being with us. Terrific. You're going to be in this chair here. Oh. Well, all kinds of news is breaking, and I'm going to let Congressman Schiff discuss that in just a moment. But, Congressman, the first thing that I wanted to ask you was about the incredible retweet that we saw from President Trump yesterday, the kind of thing that I guess we've become used to. You worry it's been normalized, but it's extremely unusual in American history, if not completely unprecedented. And this was the retweet that President Trump did of all of his opponents, two of his predecessors, Obama and Clinton, the counsel, Mr. Mueller. There were a whole bunch of them behind the jail bars. And the header on it had something to do with, when do the treason trials start? I just wondered what your reaction is and what you think the reaction of all Americans should be to something like that.
Well, you know, I don't know how many of us have had the sensation of saying that we thought at this point we couldn't be shocked or surprised by anything the president did anymore, only to find out that actually we still can be. It's obviously deplorable that the president would essentially accuse any opposition he has of treason. What I found most remarkable, after I searched those behind the bars to find out whether I was in there or not, was
Were you?
I was not. I guess he's waiting for the next meme to go around to circulate that one. But Rod Rosenstein is behind bars. So his own Deputy Attorney General, he is suggesting, may be guilty of treason. This, of course, takes place in a week when he continues to try to interfere in the Mueller investigation very overtly. It takes place at a time where he is once again dangling a pardon in front of Paul Manafort, which I think adds to the body of evidence of obstruction of justice by this president. It comes during a week in which the president said during an interview that if Democrats play tough, meaning if Democrats actually do oversight, something that hasn't happened during the first 2 years of administration when the Congress was completely controlled by the GOP, that his response will be to declassify information, which is, he's already told us his own intelligence agencies and our allies have said could burn sources. And this will be his response, that he will punish our allies and our intelligence agencies if Democrats do oversight. That's the President of the United States. And it's, one of the reasons, this week is one of the profound reasons why I think our democracy is trembling right now. Because we've never had a president, I think, so blatantly ignore the national interest, so obviously put his own personal interest first, foremost, last, middle, everything in between, and a president who really seems to have no moral compass whatsoever.
It's all about him. I think we can all see that that's the motive for President Trump most of the time. But of course, there are other forces at work here, not least the blue wave and the fact that Democrats have a majority larger than anybody really foresaw, plus 40. You were mentioning the 7 additional congressmen from California. So this will have some effect. What effect do you think it actually will have, independent of Bob Mueller? What effect will it have on Trump? What kind of check can a Democratic House provide, understanding that the Republican Senate's not going to go along with very much, and the president can always veto anything that comes out of Congress anyway?
I would say it'll have 2 or 3 broad impacts. The first is that we'll be able to put forward in the House a positive agenda, which we've talked about, which we've struggled to put forward in the minority, obviously in the House in particular, which is such a majoritarian institution where if you have one more vote than the other side, you control everything. We've been limited in showing the country what we would do if we were governing. But we'll now be able to introduce bills that will be a blueprint as we head into 2020, even if they're stopped in the Senate, for what Democrats would do if we were entrusted with control of the government. So bills on health care, to protect people's health care instead of take it away from them. Bills that address the economic challenges that Americans face. Americans are working, but fully half the country is not making enough to get by. On any given day, about half the country is just one unexpected car problem or health problem away from failing. And we'll be able to put forward a positive agenda to address those real world challenges. We'll also have an opportunity, if the president is willing to take it, to get things done. And he may decide, because as you point out, it's all about him, that it's in his narrow interest to do something bipartisan, maybe on infrastructure or prescription drug prices or something else. So there will be the opportunity, if he wants to take it, and we will work with him where there is common ground. But there will also be profound differences when it comes to oversight. This is a president who feels that he is entitled to have no opposition, that any opposition is an affront, that it's somehow an imposition on him, that it shouldn't be that way. It may be why he looks with such jealousy at autocrats around the world. But we're going to do our appropriate oversight. We are going to act as the founders intended, as a co-equal branch of government, whether the president likes it or not. And how he responds to that, we are getting some indication. Whether he will cut his nose off to spite his face and say, well, I'm not going to do anything for the country if you do oversight, time will tell. But we will do our jobs, and we will count on him to do his. But regardless of whether he does, we will do our job.
Congressman, obviously, the House has independent power of investigation and now subpoena power. And there are an almost unlimited number of subjects that you can investigate. This administration probably needs it more than most. But if you were to give us a sense of the priorities of those investigations, where do you start in the Intelligence Committee, and where does the Democratic caucus start generally?
Well, I think generally we will look for areas where the oversight is complementary to our legislative agenda. So Elijah Cummings, for example, who will chair the Government Oversight Committee, has talked about doing oversight of the high cost of prescription drugs. Now, when people think of oversight right now, because there's so much focus on the Russia investigation and other things, they think investigation. Oversight is, of course, much more broad than investigation, particularly investigation of a criminal nature. So Elijah plans to look into those bread and butter issues that people are most concerned about that affect their daily lives. But there is another category of oversight that is necessary to protect our constitutional system, to protect, for example, freedom of the press. One of the issues that I've been raising now for about half a year, which is not within the jurisdiction of my committee, but nonetheless something I care a great deal about. About 15 years ago, I co-founded and I continue to co-chair a caucus on freedom of the press. Now, I formed that caucus with a fellow classmate of mine who came into Congress with me named Mike Pence. And over the years, we focused on press freedoms around the world, on countries that were where the government was murdering journalists or the government was tolerating the murder of journalists and killers were going with impunity.
Where the press was the enemy of the people.
Where the press was the enemy of the people, and we did not think that we would need to focus so close to home. But we learned a few months ago that the president was secretly meeting with the Postmaster General in an effort to apparently browbeat the postmaster into raising postal rates on Amazon. Now, you cannot persuade me that the president gives one whit about postal rates. This was most likely an effort to punish Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post. Now, we've also seen the Justice Department take a stand which seems quite odd for this particular Trump Justice Department, and that is challenging the merger of the parent of CNN. Now, is this a rather atypical concern over antitrust, or is this an effort to punish CNN? Now, I don't know the answer, but I do think Congress ought to find out. Is the President of the United States not just rhetorically bashing the press, not trying to only withdraw the credentials of reporters he doesn't like or won't report favorably about him, but is he also using instruments of state power to punish and censor the press? That is a quintessential example, in my view, of the kind of oversight Congress needs to do, but it's been completely absent for the last 2 years. And in our committee, we're going to look at the investigative work that has not been done when it comes to Russia and Trump. We're going to look at issues like whether the Russians were laundering money through the Trump Organization and possess financial leverage over the President of the United States. We're also going to look at witnesses we think were untruthful before our committee and committed perjury, and make sure that we refer those transcripts to the special counsel. There's breaking news this morning that Michael Cohen may be pleading guilty as we speak to lying to our committee. If that's the case, it certainly appears that there's at least one truly cooperating witness with Bob Mueller.
Who won't get a pardon, in all likelihood.
Yes, I'm sure that is true as well. We will, as the Congress generally, have to prioritize what are the most important investigative threads that we were not allowed to pursue. Now, one of the threads we were not allowed to pursue was that involving Roger Stone and WikiLeaks. And we had Mr. Stone before our committee. We would like to provide those transcripts to Mr. Mueller because I have serious questions about whether he committed perjury. But more than that, looking at those connections between Mr. Stone and Mr. Corsi and Mr. Assange and the Russians and Mr. Stone and the president, obviously that is quite central to one of the conspiracy threads, of which there are many. And we will also be guided when we take over the committee in January by what Bob Mueller has been able to do. And we may or may not have a report from Bob Mueller by that point.
Do you have any sense of when Mueller will issue that report? And also, what do you think the odds are that this new acting attorney general will prevent the release of that report to the public, which, after all, has paid tens of billions of dollars to produce it?
Well, I would imagine that the primary decision on timing will come down to this: how much work needs to be done? How much work is remaining on the conspiracy issue? The challenge on the conspiracy or collusion issue is There's the strand involving Roger Stone and WikiLeaks. There's a strand involving the meeting at Trump Tower. There's a strand involving the secret meeting in the Seychelles. There are innumerable strands. And you have to decide, okay, when have we done a thorough enough job that we can make a report to the American people, or we can decide who should be indicted? And with some strands, you make more progress than with others. With some, you need to get the cooperation of other witnesses, and that means their criminal cases need to play out, as we see Michael Cohen's criminal case playing out, and Roger Stone and Paul Manafort's case playing out. But then you have the obstruction of justice issue as well. And on that issue, I think the predominant factor, because the number of witnesses there is quite finite. There are only so many actions and statements of the president. There are only so many witnesses. Most of those have been interviewed by the special counsel by now. But one of the more flagrant exceptions is the president. Now, Secretary Kelly may also be one of the exceptions. But I would imagine that the special counsel has to do the calculus. How valuable is a sit-down interview with the president? How much do I need that to know whether his intent was corrupt? Written questions are basically the testimony of the lawyers, not the witness. And it's been amusing, I guess you could say, to watch the president talk about how, no, I wrote these myself. It's like a school kid saying, no, I did the homework myself, even if it's right out of, Encyclopedia Britannica, which shows you how old I am. So to do a real interview, you need to be able to ask follow-up questions. You need to actually hear from the witness, particularly when it's an issue of intent. But what apparently has been playing out behind the scenes is people like Manafort, who have been ostensibly cooperating with Mueller, have been backdealing with the president. And so feeding information to the president's team, this is what I'm telling Mueller. So when you answer those questions, this is what Mueller knows from me, so that you can say this, but you don't have to say any more because you know the length and breadth of what I'm telling them. Now, of course, they don't know the length and breadth of what Mueller knows beyond Mr. Manafort. Mr. Manafort apparently didn't know the length and breadth of what Mueller knew, which is why he's in such trouble right now. But I do think the president will need to decide, is he going to subpoena the president? Is the value of that interview such that he needs to do it? Because that will inevitably draw this out months as it's litigated. Or is it more important that we finish the work now because of the appointment of Whitaker or for other reasons that he thinks the pressure on his investigation will be such that he cannot afford the time?
We've had some indications that Mueller believes, or at least some people around Mueller believe, that you can't indict a sitting president. And there is some precedent for that during the Nixon administration. What do you think the possibilities are that, like Nixon, Trump could be an unindicted co-conspirator?
I think that's certainly very possible. First of all, there's no constitutional prohibition on indicting a sitting president. There are prudential reasons, I think, why Mueller will likely decide not to do that, quite separate apart from what the body of evidence may be. I'm not sure that the special counsel would feel it appropriate for a lay jury of 12 people somewhere to decide the fate of the republic. It's also possible that even if he were indicted today, that a judge would decide to defer hearing of the case until after the presidency. If that is not a road the special counsel goes down, there are other alternatives. There is an unindicted co-conspirator, and one of the things that we see in this document that apparently Corsi was going to plead to and then decided not to plead to, a mention of Trump personally. And that was something that apparently quite infuriated the president. But you certainly could see an indictment in which either the president is referred to as an unindicted co-conspirator or in which the Trump organization itself is indicted. There's certainly no prohibition on indicting the organization. And so that's a possibility. It's also, more than possible that we see indictments of others around the president, but the report goes to the president's conduct. Mueller, I know him from when he was the head of the FBI. I think he's very smart, a very straight shooter. I think he's assembled quite an incredible team. I think he's very conservative, and appropriately so. And so I would expect him to take a conservative approach at the end of the day. I also should mention, because I don't think I answered this part of your last question, that we don't know what will happen with Mueller's report. When the president was talking about firing Rod Rosenstein and speculating about it, and at one point it looked like he had fired him or maybe didn't fire him, one of the things that I was emphasizing about Rod Rosenstein's job that was not apparent to most Americans is the person supervising the investigation, who has been Rod Rosenstein, but may or may not be Whitaker, has two very important responsibilities, among others. And one is to decide the scope of that investigation. Can Mueller look at money laundering when the president has tried to draw a red line and say, thou shalt not examine anything to do with my finances? But the other is what happens to the report at the end of the day. Does it get shared with Congress? Is it made public, or is it buried? And one thing I can tell you is we are determined to make sure that it is not buried. It's just too important for the public to know the full facts. And we're also determined to expose whatever role Whitaker plays in any of this. His conflicts are so apparent that we can have no confidence, the country can have no confidence in a judgment that he makes about the handling of this investigation. This is someone who auditioned for the part by his own admission, by going on TV and bashing the Mueller investigation.
And it worked.
And it worked. It worked. I mean, and it's worked over and over again. I mean, others too have found that the way you get an appointment in the Trump administration is by going on Fox and saying whatever outrageous thing you think the president would like to hear.
That raises a number of questions. So,
including, by the way, our current national security advisor.
Yes.
Who went on Fox to say at one point that maybe it wasn't the Russians who hacked the Democratic Party and Clinton. Maybe it was a false flag operation by the Obama administration.
Right.
Which I had to take a moment to figure out, how would that even work? The president would be hacking his own party headquarters so that, what, he could blame it on the Russians so that that would somehow help Hillary? I mean, it had even conspiracy theorists going, wait a minute, that's even too far for me.
Well, that's why you need the trial for treason, because all that will come out, I'm sure, in discovery.
Sure.
Look, you're saying you will push very hard in this very important position that you're undertaking, chair of the House Intelligence Committee. You will push for full disclosure to the public, not just to a handful of congressmen in a closed room reading the report. The public will get to see this report if you have anything to say about it.
Yes, we're going to push to make the maximum amount of this information available to the public. I don't think that it's going to be sufficient in any way for the Congress to say, trust us, we've read the report, and here's what we think it says. This is all you need to know, public. You can go about your business. I just don't think that's going to cut it. And so I hope that the decision is made by the Justice Department to make a broad public report of its findings. And we don't want a situation where we have to wait 30 years or however long for a declassification review for the public to know what took place. And there will certainly be elements of this that are classified, information that we have obtained from classified sources that may not be able to be shared in that form with the public. But we ought to strive to make as most of this available and accessible to the public at the end of the day as possible.
One change that some are speculating will occur now with your becoming chairman on the House side is that there will be a much better relationship with the Senate Intelligence Committee. I know you already worked with them to a certain degree as the ranking member, but Senator Burr and Senator Warner on the Senate side have been very cooperative. It's been more bipartisan, certainly, than we've seen on the House side. Is that true? Will you be working more closely with them, and how will that affect what Congress is able to say and do as a result?
I think that will be true. I have a lot of respect for Chairman Burr as well as the Vice Chairman Warner. I've worked well with both. And it's my hope that not only can we improve coordination between the committees, but that we can restore comity within our own committee. And I've begun talking to my Republican colleagues about doing that. And I think a couple of our first and primary tasks ought to be the restoration of some regular order within our committee, but also the relationship between our committee and the intelligence community that was really ruptured by the publication of this Nunes memorandum, which, just to remind your audience, the majority used a never-before-used House rule to selectively declassify information and publish it, and do so in a very misleading way by cherry-picking certain things and mischaracterizing them. And the intelligence community and the FBI told our committee, don't do this. First of all, it's misleading and fraudulent. But second, you could burn sources of information. Now, we've had a compact with the intelligence community. They share their deepest secrets with us, so we can do our oversight, and we will respect those secrets and keep them safe so their sources are not compromised. That memorandum was a terrible breach of that. And so we will need to rebuild that trust. And this week, as we were talking about earlier, the president has threatened to declassify information as punishment if Democrats do oversight. And what he's referring to there is a continuation of that Nunes memorandum saga. This time being led by the president instead of being led by his acolytes in Congress. Now, we can't control what the president does, but we can control what our committee does, and we're certainly never going to go down that road again.
Nunes will still be he will be the ranking member now, the former chair of the Intelligence Committee. Is he going to be the ranking member?
I don't know. That's a Republican leadership decision, and they don't confide in me. I don't know why, but we are presuming that will be the case.
I feel the same way about Dean, so I understand what you're talking about. Well, given the relationship between Democrats and Republicans on the Intelligence Committee, I'm sure your task will not be easy to establish comity, but
it won't be easy. Now, I will say this: that, the good news, bad news of our committee over the last 2 years is on Russia we had just irreconcilable differences, which didn't start out that way. That wasn't the case until the midnight run, when our chairman in the middle of the night went to some undisclosed location and said he had obtained highly classified information showing a vast conspiracy in the Obama administration to surveil the Trump administration, all of which was nonsense. But within days, and he said he had to present this to the White House. It was of that importance. We learned within days that secret location he'd gone to in the middle of the night was the White House, where he got information that he then presented to the White House. And that just blew up our committee, because you can't run a credible investigation when you're basically working in cahoots with the subject of that investigation. But the good news is, notwithstanding how we were not able to work together meaningfully on the Russia investigation, is that we did compartmentalize our differences on that and do all the other work of the committee in a nonpartisan way, which is the bread and butter of the committee, the oversight of our agencies, the hard work to make sure that they're talking to each other, that they're following all the rules, that they're protecting privacy, that we're making the right investments in human intelligence and signals intelligence. And so that work is all proceeded apace, notwithstanding all the very public and visible differences. But I would like us to get back to some regular order on all of our work, if we can. So the Republicans walked away from the Russia investigation. We will invite them to walk back. It'll be up to them whether they do so. We've continued to bring in witnesses even after they walked away and invited them when witnesses have been willing to come in. Now, we couldn't compel them to come in, but there were witnesses who were willing to come in even with an invitation. They were waiting to be asked. And we would invite the Republicans to say, hey, we've got such and such a witness coming in. Would you like to sit in on the interview? And they not only did not want to hear what the witnesses had to say, they would call the witnesses and say, please don't come in, because they didn't want us to hear either. Now, if they continue that kind of practice, obviously, we're not going to have much success. But it's my hope we'll have a lot of new members, a lot of new Republican members on the committee, that we can begin in a much more amicable fashion.
And some of the fire breathers, of course, will be leaving.
Yes.
So that may help the situation. Let me ask about one other thing. We were talking about what Congress could do. Everyone talks about the fact that Donald Trump is the first presidential candidate or president since the 1970s never to have revealed even a single year's worth of taxes. And of course, there's that provision in law left over from that wonderful scandal under Warren G. Harding, Teapot Dome, which we all remember. Many of us lived through that. It was fascinating. But there's a provision in law permitting either house of Congress to request of the IRS, or really demand from the IRS, anybody's tax returns. Will the House invoke that provision, and could it be challenged in court? Could it be delayed? Or do you think you could really get that?
Well, my expectation is that that issue will be front and center for the Ways and Means Committee, because the statutory mechanism works through that committee. Now, we have a deep interest in that in our committee as well, for whatever the tax returns would tell us about Russian investment in Donald Trump. So I would expect that will be a decision that Chairman Neal will make. And I think that the relevance of his tax returns would be, is our policy vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia? Is the President's, I think, misrepresentations of what we know about the Khashoggi murder being driven by personal financial interest? The President has said in the past that he gets tens of millions of dollars from Saudi Arabia. And this is why he likes the Saudis so much. And he said that fairly recently. But of course, most recently, he has said he has no business with the Saudis. Now, which is it? Both can't be true. Well, the tax returns would tell us which is true, or may tell us which is true. And so on issues of emoluments, on issues of conflict of interest, on issues of national security, there are lots of bases for which Congress would have a need to know in terms of the tax returns. But that'll be ultimately an issue for the Ways and Means Committee. Will it be challenged? Almost certainly. I mean, if you look at how Donald Trump has treated the special counsel, his own Justice Department, with any step they take, by accusing them of being on a witch hunt and constantly vilifying them, and as we talked about earlier, suggesting they're all guilty of treason, you can imagine what he will do to prevent Congress and the public from learning what his tax returns show, particularly if those tax returns show either in its most serious aspect that he's compromised financially, either to the Saudis or the Russians or some other foreign power, or merely that he's not worth what he says he's worth, or because they would illustrate to tax experts who could examine them that there was tax fraud involved in his tax returns. I have to expect that for whatever reason, whatever motivation, given how he's approached Bob Mueller, he'll fight any kind of compliance with that statute.
Would you or will you encourage the Ways and Means Committee to invoke that provision of law and seek the tax returns? Because it does affect your investigation?
Well, I would say this. I think that we need to determine whether the President of the United States is acting in the national interest or whether he's acting in his personal financial interest. And if the only way we can be certain of that is to know what it says in his tax returns, then we need to know. If there are other ways to answer that question, then there are other ways that we can pursue. But if the best evidence ends up being his tax returns, there's a need to know. And certainly the statements he has made about his financial ties to the Saudis are deeply concerning. The statements his sons have made about their financial ties to the Russians are deeply concerning. And the fact that he would depart from such a well-practiced norm of any presidential candidate, let alone president, disclosing their tax returns is cause for deep, deep concern.
I know you have to go very soon. I've saved one easy question for last. It has two parts. It's very, you can answer it.
There is no easy question with two parts.
As well, and especially the last question. It's never easy. But first of all, will you remain among the minority of Democrats not throwing your hat in the presidential ring for 2020? Are you going to stay as House Intelligence Committee chair?
Is that the first part or the second part?
That's the first part. I want to save the second part. Let me see what you say to that, because John Kerry's running. Yeah. I mean, my God.
If I don't run, I'll be the only one in town apparently not running. Right. It's fully my intention to chair the Intel Committee and do the work there. I would never say never, but that's fully my expectation. I've got plenty of work on my hands.
That was a good answer. And finally, this really is the easy one. In your view, what's the threshold for impeachment?
Well, I tried an impeachment case. There are not many people who can say that.
Really?
About 10 years ago, while on the Judiciary Committee, we impeached a federal judge, a corrupt federal judge from New Orleans. Now, I know what you're thinking, corruption, Louisiana, impossible. But he took us to trial in the Senate, and I was asked to lead the prosecution in the Senate. And I had to learn a lot about impeachment. And interestingly, we impeached him on 4 counts. One that involved conduct completely prior to his appointment to federal office. And that raised a question of almost first impression. Can you be impeached for conduct that took place before you took office? We also impeached him for lying to the Senate during his Senate judicial confirmation. It's also a rather timely issue. And the Senate convicted on both those counts, convicted on all the counts.
Really?
On the first count, it was on the count involving prior conduct. It was very interesting because we had to go back 150 years to find another precedent involving another judge who was impeached in the House on 7 counts of prior conduct, 7 counts of conduct while on the federal bench, and 1 omnibus count. And the Senate 150 years ago, in that case involving a judge named Archibald, convicted of all the counts while he was on the federal bench, but acquitted of all the prior conduct, and then convicted on the omnibus count. And so on first blush, it looked like maybe you can't be convicted of prior conduct. But when we dug into the Senate record, what we discovered was several of the senators spoke about their verdicts 150 years ago and said that they believed you could be impeached and removed for prior conduct, but the quality of the evidence on the prior counts was insufficient. So it wasn't a constitutional issue for them. It was an issue of they hadn't met the burden of proof. Well, that issue has now been resolved in the most contemporaneous way you can, a case that's only now 10 years old. But what I also learned during that trial is while there is a rather nebulous standard of what constitutes a high crime or misdemeanor, there's a very practical political standard as well. And the practical political standard, I believe, right now, as regards Mr. Trump, is would the evidence that Mr. Mueller produces rise to the level that conservative Republican or Democratic senators would be able to go back to their states and make the case that this president's conduct is so incompatible with office that I had to vote to remove him. And this wasn't about nullifying an election that those other people didn't like. If they can't make that argument, there is no impeachment no matter how high the crime or serious the misdemeanor. That's a very high bar in a country as polarized as this one. And so I think the evidence would have to be very clear and very disqualifying. Now, this president may meet that bar, but it's not something I think we ought to prejudge. The only thing worse, I think, than putting the country through the wrenching experience of an impeachment is putting the country through the wrenching experience of a failed impeachment. And so it was designed to be an extraordinary remedy. It should be considered an extraordinary remedy when the more routine remedy is removal in the next election, which will be here before we know it. So I think we should reserve judgment until we see what Bob Mueller has to say and then see if it meets that standard.
Boy, you've given us a lot to chew on. That was great. And we appreciate enormously the time that you've given us. No one's busier in Washington right now than you are. So we thank you for that, and we wish you good luck and Godspeed in your work over the next 2 years. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you very much.
Enjoyed it. Wonderful. I think your staff is waiting. It's a waiting. Thank you. For the next panel, we're a little bit late, but you know, it's an academic conference. You would expect that. Ken Stroop, Associate Director of the Center for Politics, is going to introduce Nia Malika Henderson, who will be chairing the next panel, and we'll look forward to what they have to say. Ken?
Good morning, and we'd also like to welcome, there are over 100 viewers online, and we encourage you, if you're watching online, to tweet the conference and Facebook it, let others know that it's available for viewing live. So welcome to the online audience, as well as all of you who are gathered here with us this morning. One quick housekeeping measure. Could I please ask you, if you haven't done it already, would you take just a quick second and put your mobile phones, any sort of mobile devices, on vibrate? That'll be enormously helpful, especially to our cameras in the back, so they're not picking up all the tweets and hums and songs and everything else that are. So we're going to move now to our first panel, which is the midterms. What did they mean, and where are we headed? And I'm going to introduce the moderator of that first panel, who will then introduce the rest of the panelists. Nia Malika Henderson is a senior political reporter for CNN, reporting on politics, policies, and people shaping Washington. Nia regularly appears as a panelist for CNN's Inside Politics, The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer, and CNN Tonight with Don Lemon. Prior to joining CNN, she was a national political reporter for the Washington Post, where she covered the White House, the 2012 presidential campaign, and the 2010 midterm elections. Nia graduated from Duke University with a bachelor's degree in literature and cultural anthropology, and earned a master's degree from Yale University in American Studies and Columbia University in journalism. So would you please welcome the moderator for our first panel, Nia Malika Henderson.
Thank you. I am introducing, I don't have any words here to introduce, but can we just bring folks out? We've got Maria Cardona is here. We've got Kondik also. I don't know if this is the right order. Symone as well, and Glen as well. I don't have anything to read. You're going to find out all about them and their smart thoughts very soon. And we thank you for being here. So we're just going to dive right in. I feel like in some ways this has been the longest midterms I've ever covered. I was on set for like 12 hours at CNN. We left at 5 a.m. We weren't really sure then what kind of wave it was. Was it a small wave? Was it a big wave? Was it just a trickle? And I think now, today, with this last race that I don't know if it's officially been called, but this race out in California, it looks like there's a pickup for 40 seats for Democrats. So I want to just start with you, Symone, to talk about what happened. Like, what are your takeaways from these midterms?
So look, I think one, I'm so happy to be here. I love the Institute of Politics at UVA, and I've spent a lot of time up here at GW. So it's always great to be back with the Institute of Politics family. Look, I think what happened during the midterm elections is Democrats were unusually very good at being on message, despite everything that was happening around them. And I say unusually because we usually don't do that well. Sometimes we see the shiny object and it bounces away. But Democrats were laser focused on talking about health care and the economy as it relates to middle-class Americans across the country. And that's what almost every single House, candidate, but also I would also say these gubernatorial candidates, they all talked about health care. And that is why I think you saw a pickup of a number of governor's seats. Democrats now sit in the governor's mansions in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, just to name a few, which, if you remember in 2016, were key to why Hillary Clinton is currently not sitting in the White House. So I think the ability to stay on message through everything that was happening during the midterm election is what yielded Democrats the results that they got.
And Kyle, what's your takeaway?
Well, it certainly was a wave in the House and a wave in the governorships, but not in the Senate. But
right.
we could sort of see that coming in advance because the Democrats were dealing with one of the worst Senate maps that any party has had to defend, particularly in a midterm year where they didn't have the White House. And usually, if you don't hold the White House in a midterm year, you do pretty well. And of course, Democrats did in the House and the governors, just not necessarily in the Senate. Republicans ended up netting 2 seats in the Senate. We just concluded the race for the Senate after Mississippi's runoff happened on Tuesday night. And also what had happened here in some ways was kind of a further alignment of politics of American politics along straight party lines. So going into this election, there were 25 U.S. House seats won by Hillary Clinton in 2016 that had Republican representatives in the House. There are now going to be only 3 of those, and that's assuming that David Valadao loses that 40th House seat out in California. That's a district that Hillary Clinton won by about 15 points. It looks like he's probably not going to win. Democrat T.J. Cox is likely to win that seat. At the same time, the number of Democrats in Trump-won districts went from 13 to 31, but only in 13 of those 31 districts did Trump get more than 50% of the vote. And so a lot of the districts that Democrats picked up were either ones that Clinton had won or ones that Trump won but are kind of marginal.
And Maria, I remember talking to you in the days before the midterms, and you were so nervous. And I couldn't figure out if you were nervous because Democrats are always nervous, or you
That's
were.
one reason.
Yeah. Talk about that.
Sure. Well, I was also nervous because we had 2016 PTSD.
Yeah.
And, we had one outcome that we were all so sure of going into 2016, and it didn't happen. So I think that Democrats were understandably nervous. But I also had seen, more so than in any other midterm, all of the machinations that went into the 2018 midterms. And what I mean by that is that I was in close contact with the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the DCCC as we call them, and they were just masterful this time around, not just in making sure that their candidates and the candidates themselves, as Symone said, were incredible at staying on message in terms of health care and the economy, an economy that works for everybody. But the candidates that ran for the Democrats, I think, were also illustrative of what kind of candidates we can run that really represent the districts where they live. And as a woman and as a Latina, I'm extremely proud of this new incoming class of Democrats because it is They have record numbers of women, badass women, these women who, flew combat planes and were veterans.
MMA fighter as well.
Yes, exactly. CIA operatives, doctors, lawyers. I mean, just these incredible women. And also a record number of women who were African American, Latino, Muslim, LGBT, just really incredibly representative of the multicultural communities that make up the country. My other takeaway from this election, though, and I think this is what really gives me hope going into 2020, is that it really was not just a blue wave, but a blue tsunami. And the reason I say that is because we are starting to realize, again, with the most probable take of this 40th seat, but that the overwhelming record number of votes that the Democrats got will be like nothing we've ever seen in history. We will have been very close to 9 million more votes than Republicans did, and that even outpaces the old record in 1974 post-Watergate in terms of how many votes Democrats got in a midterm election. And I think that's important for several reasons. Again, going back to Symone's point about how our candidates were able to really stay on message was one of the things that really helped us. But the other thing that really helped us is that the President of the United States stayed on message as well, and that helped us too, because what that underscored in these midterm elections is that it was not necessarily any longer the economy stupid, it was your character dummy that was on the ballot. And what was a resounding rejection of what this president, how he has governed, how he has divided the country, his policies, his rhetoric, how people realized that this was not representative of the country that they loved so much, of a country whose values they held so dear. And when you look at the number of people who rejected that, the economy, even though they did well, these people were doing well, and for the most part, I'm talking about college-educated suburban women who were doing well. They thought other things were a lot more important than just the economy and voting for, the sitting president and his party because other things were so much more important. And as a Latina, the other thing that was really resonant to me is that the communities of color also came out in droves and in record numbers to say they're not going to take it anymore. Enough is enough. There was a poll that came out right prior to the election from the Pew Hispanic Center that said 55% of Hispanics in this country felt unsafe. They felt that either somebody in their family, somebody in their community, somebody that they knew, friends of theirs, could be deported tomorrow. They felt unsafe even if their families had been here for centuries before this was the United States of America. And I think, again, all of that contributed and gelled on November 6, 2018, for a record number of people to come out and say, this president and what he represents and his party, who has been unable to stand up to him, is not what we want in leadership. And we want a check on this White House, and that's what they voted for.
And Glenn, I see you there flipping through what looks to be some sort of PowerPoint presentation, and you're a data guy. Talk about what you have seen in the data from these past midterms that really sticks out to you in terms of what happened and why.
Well, I mean, it's certainly, there's so much more data than there used to be about campaigns, and so many different more ways to slice it that really, if you want, I think we're supposed to be done by 11:15. I'll just take the next 65 minutes. No, I think a couple of trends and observations. Number one is when a president's approval rating is below 49% in going into a midterm election, the average loss, House seat loss, is 39 seats. Democrats hit their mark at 40. That's one observation, which is, I don't think this outcome was a surprise to anyone. Kyle and I talked a few days before the election, and I predicted a 2-seat Republican Senate gain and a 38-seat Republican House loss. But in terms of what this means for the future, a couple of things. I've heard the phrase blue wave, but really it was also a green wave. When you looked at the amount that Democratic candidates outraised their Republican opponents by, it was over $300 million in the House and Senate, which is just a huge number. And the Democratic Party, different committees, outraised the Republican committees by about $111 million. And this was through the election, what was reported up through November 8th. So it's possible that that gap is even wider. So Republicans have to get off the stick and do a better job of raising money the same way Democrats have been. Also, you know, the most daunting news, I think, in the data was suburban seats. Democrats won 70.1% of House suburban seats. Republicans won 81% of rural seats. Democrats won 98.8% of urban seats. And honestly, I should know the answer to which urban seat Republicans hold, but it escapes me right now. Kyle probably knows. But the point is you cannot get blown out in the suburbs.
I don't actually, I'm sorry.
Thanks. Great help, Kyle. You can't get blown out in the suburbs like Republicans were and expect to be in control in the House. So we need to do better with suburban voters, particularly suburban women, college-educated voters. And those are the groups that really have gone strongly, along with younger voters, to the Democrats. And, you know, eventually the math adds up, and that's what happened in this election, is with this huge turnout, the highest percentage in a midterm since 1914. And obviously in 1914, there was you know, much more, there was not the kind of voter franchise that there is today. So just a huge turnout, huge money advantage for the Democrats and huge advantage in the suburbs, all added up to a blue and green wave for them.
And Symone, you hear Glen there talking about some of the bad news for his party in terms of suburban voters, particularly suburban women voters. When you look at what happened in 2018, this midterm cycle, what worries do you have? I mean, it can't all be good news.
It can't all be good news. Look, the worries that I have are about who the Democratic Party apparatus, particularly the party committees in this respect, think is electable. And if you look at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, usually on their red to blue program, i.e. seats that were currently held by Republicans that they want to flip to blue, i.e. Democratic seats, they usually only have maybe like 25, maybe 30 folks on that program. This year they expanded that program to 92 people, and a number of those candidates did well. A number of the folks that people are heralding going into this 116th Congress were not people that the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee recruited to run. Right. I'm thinking of Lauren Underwood. I'm thinking of Colin Allred. I'm thinking of Ayanna Pressley in Boston, just to name a few. I mean, frankly, I'm thinking of Stacey Abrams, who lost her governor's race, but in Georgia, 1.2 million more voters cast ballots in this Georgia election than previously. Those were all candidates that the party committees did not recruit to run. And so as we look to 2019 and again 2020, not just a presidential election, there'll be governor's races, there'll be more House races, there'll be Senate races. I think the party has to be cautious about who they think is electable and who they think is not electable, because had it been left up to the party committee, we would not see the diversity in this 116th Congress that everyone's so happy to talk about.
And Kyle, obviously there's the rural, urban, suburban divide and this educational divide that we're also starting to see more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think there's always been sort of an urban versus rural gap in American politics, and it's sort of shifted over the years, but it's getting extremely sharp. And I think that those were trends that were already happening pre-Donald Trump. You know, places like Appalachia, so West Virginia, Southeast Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, et cetera. Those places were already kind of trending away, starting maybe with George W. Bush in 2000, and maybe a negative reaction to Al Gore, and sort of the Democrats becoming even more kind of the environmentally conscious, socially liberal party. You know, it was those things before, but it sort of became more identified with those issues with Gore and going forward. And so you started to see those places falling away, and they're really falling away now. And it's posing a electoral challenge for Democrats as you go forward to 2020, because they don't necessarily need to win Ohio, but they probably do need to win Pennsylvania, do need to win Michigan, do need to win Wisconsin. And yes, there are growing affluent or diverse places in those states that are going to vote heavily Democratic. There are big college town, state capital communities like Madison and Wisconsin and Lansing and Michigan. But then you've got these vast swaths of rural areas that used to provide votes for Democrats and don't anymore. And here's, if you want to look at a bright sign for Republicans in this election, you got to look at Florida. Because for incumbent Senator Bill Nelson, a Democrat, to lose in a year like this really is inexcusable for Democrats, I think. And Democrats also failed to win the governor's race. Granted, those races were super close. Florida's always super close. But you even look at the map of Florida, and you know, Democrats actually made some pretty good strides. They won some of the key swing counties around Tampa, St. Petersburg. They won Duval County, which is where Jacksonville is. You look at the map and you say, how'd the Democrats lose? And it was because Trump, I think, pushed a lot of the kind of rural and exurban counties to becoming more and more Republican, and then they stuck with the Republicans in 2018. And also, frankly, the Hispanic vote in Florida was not as good for Democrats as they needed it to be. And you could see that in Miami. You could see that in places around Orlando. And look, Florida is probably the most important state in American politics. It has been in recent years, and it probably will be going forward. And so it's just crazy to me that you could have this wave-style election, and yet the Democrats sputter out in this classic swing state. So that, to me, is the big disappointment for Democrats is Florida.
Maria, talk about the Hispanic vote. Bad news for Democrats, obviously, in Florida. Probably good news in terms of Latinos in a state like Arizona. Yes. But I feel like every cycle there's all this, sort of hope about the Hispanic vote in terms of Democrats, but then ultimately disappointment oftentimes.
Well, I think overall it was, we saw good news in the Hispanic vote overall and nationally with Democrats. Democrats took 70% of the Hispanic vote overall. Republicans took 23% overall. But you're right, in Florida, it was a big disappointment. And I think what this speaks to is something that I have been talking about forever. I'm sure Symone agrees with this as well, and that is that the party still is not doing enough as a whole organization, meaning not just one specific party committee, but all of the party committees and all of the people who invest money into getting out the votes. They're not making enough investments in doing that in minority communities to the extent that they could in order to take advantage of the potential that is there. So in Florida, the DeSantis got something like 40-something% of the Hispanic vote.
And he had a Latino running mate, right? A Latina,
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that helped. And Gillum got 53% of the Hispanic vote. But the polls showed that he was doing much better. And I think overall the polls showed that he was doing much better than what it ended up happening. And so what I think this continues to tell us is that the parties need to do a much better job of investing in getting out the vote early on. And I think Florida specifically, there was a lot of hope in there and a lot of potential.
Too much hope, not enough door knocking.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, across the board, there was a lot of hope because there was a huge surge in the Puerto Rican population that had left the island because of Hurricane Maria. And a lot of the Puerto Ricans who had left Puerto Rico and went to Florida were very disappointed in Trump, clearly because of how they mishandled the post-Maria catastrophe. But I don't think Democrats did enough in order to get that population out to vote. I don't think they did enough to get young Cubans out to vote, which now are much more leaning Democratic. And I don't think that we definitely saw the potential that is still there in Florida for Democrats in the Hispanic vote.
Glen, what do you think about the polls, right? There were a lot of misgivings about polls from 2016. People say they got it wrong, even though the national polls got it pretty right. What do we learn about the polling industry from 2018? Did they mostly get it right?
I believe that we did, for the most part. Not every poll is going to be right, and the private polls that the campaigns do and the parties do, those are the ones that people are making decisions off of. And those, from a political campaign standpoint, those are the more important ones rather than the public polls. Public polls, by the way, public polls do not affect how people are going to vote. That just simply is an old saw that is flat out not true, because I've seen plenty of polls where one candidate is shown to be losing and yet they still win. I think the polls this time, we've done a better job, pollsters have done a better job over the last 2 cycles of getting the right mix because, and that's, by the way, one of the challenges, getting the right mix demographically. Both in terms of African Americans, percent of the vote, the electorate that's African American, percent that is Hispanic, percent that is white, percent that is Republican, percent that is Democratic. Those things all matter because we're down to such party line voting now. There's not, we're now in almost a parliamentary system where you're voting for the party rather than the person. For the longest time, when I broke into polling back in 1985, Republicans, one of the things that we were trying to do is figure out, okay, what Democratic votes could we get? Democrats, when they were successful, they would get a whole bunch of Republican votes. That doesn't happen that much anymore because if you're a Republican, you're voting Republican. If you're a Democrat, you're voting Democratic. There's no more Reagan Democrats in the South, for instance. If you're a white Democrat in the South, you were voting for the Democrats. You had plenty of opportunity to either become an independent or a Republican in the last couple of decades. And if you're a Democrat, you are still a Democrat. So the hardest thing is what is the makeup of the electorate? And I think given how on point the polling was this time, I think people have done pollsters have done a much better job of, sorting through and figuring out, okay, this is the most likely turnout. And by the way, in a year where turnout exceeded all expectations, that's a very, if I can pat my industry on the back, because God knows a lot of people like to kick it, that was something that I think was very impressive.
And Symone, we heard Maria talk about Latino voters and some disappointment for her and Democrats in Florida, better news in a state like Arizona. What about African-American voters? You saw in 2016 something of a drop-off with African-American voters from what they were doing for Obama in prior elections. And we always know that African-American voters do just drop off, as do all voters in midterm elections. What did we see in these midterms from African-American voters?
I thought, I like, particularly if we talk about Wisconsin, for example, where Tony Evers and his running mate Mandela Barnes finally, it was a long Democratic hope to oust Scott Walker for so long, and we finally did it. And the way that happened was a hodgepodge of a coalition, but there was a surge in African-American voters in Milwaukee and Madison, if you will, and in Racine County, which is the county that Paul Ryan's seat currently sits in, where Randy Bryce lost that seat, but there was a very considerable African-American turnout program, a paid canvas operation that works in African-American communities. And so I think we saw African-American voters come out. Again, in Georgia, for example, 1.2 million new voters, many of them voters of color, overwhelmingly African-American. The question becomes, how do we engage these folks in a primary process, and will the energy stay up? There was a lot of fervor around the midterm elections for everyone. And leading up to the midterms, there were so many elections, if you will, special elections. You had Doug Jones in Alabama, where black women were key to Doug Jones coming out with that win. You had Virginia. So there are all these examples and instances and ways for folks to be engaged and be involved. When it comes to a primary election, though, particularly on the Democratic side, I think it'll be interesting to watch how black voters perform outside of South Carolina, for example. So I'm looking at Mississippi. I'm looking at Georgia. I'm looking at the Super Tuesday states, and then I'm looking at how do black voters turn out in Michigan. In 2016, there was a drop-off in black voter turnout in Michigan in the general election. I would argue because there were some doors that just weren't knocked in places in Michigan outside of Detroit. So it's really about the engagement aspect, and I am, if you're asking me what concerns me, one of the things that concerns me is the, in a midterm election, it's the DCCC and the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee where all the money goes and they do work to, do these turnout models, give money to candidates. In a presidential year, the money should go to the DNC. And there is a real question right now on the Democratic side of the aisle on what type of infrastructure does the DNC have to truly go out there and lay the groundwork for this engagement in communities. So when the primary process is over and we go into a general election, that the engagement and the touches were there. I don't know if the DNC currently has the infrastructure to get the job done. I know they're working on it, but the question is, can they scale up in enough time?
She, of course, worked for Bernie Sanders, so yeah, some context
But
there.
I'm very nice and happy with the party. I met with them the other day. This is why I know that I don't know.
So, Kyle, historically, what can midterms and the results of midterms tell us about the next presidential election going forward? Obama, of course, did historically horribly in 2010, went on to win pretty easily in 2012.
There isn't much predictive value for the midterm. Let's say if Trump loses in 2020 and does poorly, we could go back and say, oh, well, 2018 told us that. But it's not going to tell us necessarily in advance. And that's true historically. There have been a lot of instances where you have a president do poorly in that person's first midterm. Ronald Reagan in 1982 is an example. Bill Clinton certainly in 1994. George W. Bush did great in his first midterm and then had a really difficult re-election campaign where he won, but not in some sort of big landslide. And of course, you mentioned Obama had a terrible midterm in 2010, and that was not necessarily predictive of the future for him. And so I think it's tempting to say, oh well, Republicans did really poorly, Trump's finished. I don't really think it works that way. I mean, I go into this election, this 2020 election, thinking that, it's basically, you kind of look at it as a toss-up to start with the Democrats having, 7 million candidates to pick from, or 7 million and one, or, however many it ends up being.
Maybe Adam Schiff, too.
Right, yeah, maybe. And so, we don't know who they're going to nominate. We honestly, we would assume Trump will be on the ballot, but maybe he wouldn't be for one reason or another. I will say this, though, that, the Republicans, based on the state of the economy and the fact that we were not in the midst of a major unpopular foreign war, this wasn't necessarily a bad environment. It was sort of a bad environment because of Trump. And I also think that Republicans may have overreached legislatively on a few things. I don't think that the tax bill necessarily was an asset to them, particularly in some of these suburban districts where voters may have thought that some of the changes maybe weren't going to benefit them. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But perception is sort of more important than reality in these things. And that leads one to wonder, would Trump sort of underperform the so-called fundamentals in 2020 as well? You'd think that actually the fundamentals were sort of set up well for a Republican nominee in 2016. Trump ended up winning, but he didn't win the national popular vote. One wonders if maybe he would underperform that again, although because of the unique sort of strengths of his electoral coalition, he doesn't necessarily have to win the national popular vote because of his strength in some of these Midwestern states that are so electorally important, and Florida, where again, if the midterm is predictive in Florida, that's certainly not good news for Democrats there.
And Maria, if you were advising a Democratic hopeful for 2020, what would you be telling them in terms of when they should start thinking about getting out there? What should their messaging be? What the kind of political landscape looks like?
So that's a great question. And I think that if there's one thing we learned from 2016, good or bad, is that voters are looking for authenticity. And one of the things that we also saw in 2018, for example, with the big rise, and even though he didn't win, the huge excitement around a candidate like Beto O'Rourke, for example. Authenticity really matters. That's why people loved Stacey Abrams. That's why they loved Andrew Gillum. That's why they loved all of these. The candidates who won were, I think, first and foremost, very authentic to the issues that they cared about, to the districts that they were running in. And so my very first urging to any candidate who's going to be running in 2020 is they have to be authentic. They have to be real. They have to be organic. Because if there's one thing that we saw from voters, from the young millennials to the multicultural coalition, to even everybody who voted for Trump, is that they will smell BS from a mile away. And so no matter who you are, what you do, you have to speak with an authentic voice. The other thing I would say is that things are constantly changing from a political standpoint in this country.
Yep.
And that's why
By the second, it feels like, yeah.
Nothing is predictive, and I think Democrats would be very stupid if they assume, simply because of how the midterm elections turned out, that it's going to be easy peasy cakewalk for us in 2020. I don't think that it will be. I think that it will be more difficult for Trump to win in 2020 if he's on the ballot, but I don't think that we can predict that, because the electorate as a whole and in general repudiated Trumpism in the 2018 midterms, that is going to happen again in 2020. Now, I will say this. You have seen his base shrink. His current base is still, I think, very solid for him. And I think it has come down to the people who, like he told us, he can get up on Fifth Avenue and kill somebody and he still would not lose supporters. I think that's where we are with his base right now, with a 38% approval rating. I don't think he can win with a 38% approval rating. But again, to your point, maybe he doesn't need to if the electoral map is such that his base are in the places where he needs them to be. But I will say this, there were a lot of people who voted for him in 2016 who I think really did believe that perhaps he was going to do the famous pivot once he came into office, or at least hoped that he would. And he has not. And we have seen that no matter how much hope Trump supporters on the Hill have and Trump supporters on the air have, and we've heard them ad nauseum, oh, well, you know, he really shouldn't do this, he should do more of that. He's never going to do more of that, because we have seen in the last 2 years who he is. And he will always be true to that. Whether that is going to be enough to keep enough of his base for 2020, I think is something that Democrats can certainly run on, in terms of making sure that people who are sick of and afraid of how this president has governed, we continue to speak to those issues, but in a way that is relevant to people in their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, Simone's going to jump in here.
Yeah, to add to that, I also think that so any of the 7,000,001 candidates that think they want to run for president on the Democratic side of the aisle, I think depending on who they are, they have to go early. I think most people will have to get out there early. So you will see people announcing I mean, we could have saw somebody announce this month, but I don't know. But I think we'll see people announcing, as I think by March, we will have at least a number of very credible candidates with money into the race, because this is going to be a robust primary. One, if you only want to do small dollar fundraising, there's only so many small dollar fundraisers in America that you can get money from. There's only so many, if there are 15 people, let's say, that decide to put their name on the ballot, 7 of those candidates are viable, to have money, will go a long way. You have to be in not only Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, and Nevada, but now California's voting starts earlier. So you also have to have money, time, resources, and organizational capacity to go to California. In terms of message, I think candidates have to make sure that they have to find something. And so whether you want to talk about, I think it's some version of non-dirty economic populism. I think Donald Trump's version of populism is a dirty populism, if you will, that is intrinsically mixed up with racism and xenophobia and ethnocentrism. But there is something there to this populist line of thinking. But look, it's going to be about which candidate stands out on the debate stage, and which candidate can build the infrastructure in places like South Carolina, in places like Iowa, to be successful. In order to do that, you have to be out there early.
Simone, quick follow-up for you, and I just want a yes or no. Should Bernie Sanders run again?
Look, I think Senator
Yes or no?
Yes if he wants to, no if he doesn't.
That's good. Very clever. Well played, Simone. Kyle, you want to jump in? And Glenn, I'm going to get you after Kyle to kind of get a sense of what what Trump's path to victory looks like. But Kyle first.
Just a quick note. So the 2016 presidential nomination battle basically started in mid-December of 2014, which, if you look at the calendars, just a couple weeks away in terms of a comparable point in the calendar. And that was when Jeb Bush, who seemed like a front runner at the time when he announced, basically got into the race. And I just bring that up to say that we're probably going to start seeing people get in here real soon, maybe even before the holidays.
Yeah, and so Glenn, what does Donald Trump's path to re-election look like?
Let me just make a couple of quick observations on the Democratic side, and then I'll actually answer I promise I will answer your question. But the first thing is given the number of Democrats who are going to run, I was thinking that for the debates, we could have them sitting out there. And it would...
In the audience.
That's great.
Right, in the audience up here. So, no, and it's number one. And then the other thing is I do think that you're going to have a longer, more drawn-out process on the Democratic side, just because so many donors are hyped up, excited, and angry at President Trump on the so many Democratic donors, that candidates who might have dropped out sooner because they had problems in the past raising money, I think it'll be easier to sustain. And then the other thing is they're going to look for, I don't need to hit singles and doubles. I need to hit a home run in the debate. Yeah. I need to come up with something that separates me or at least elevates me. And if they're able to do that, there's going to be people that we don't even expect at this point in time. We expect them probably to run, but not necessarily to do well. Can't predict who's going to kind of hit on that hot formula. It's going to be so different than anything we've seen before. Then in terms of President Trump's path to victory, I think when you look at for example, and Kyle mentioned this, the 1994-1996 difference is one of the reasons is Bill Clinton said, I want to survive, I want to win, what do I need to do to change? And I think Barack Obama did to a lesser extent. I think he was still kind of more true to himself than Clinton was. And by the way, I'm not knocking Clinton. The triangulation strategy worked and worked really well for him. So, the question is, and I think somebody else on the panel had touched on this, is President Trump willing to change it all? And here's the challenges. First of all, in some of the research that I did April of 2017 for Center for Politics, where Larry and his team hired me to go around and do an online survey of Trump voters as well as focus groups of Trump voters. The biggest concern that I heard, and this was April of 2017, and it hasn't gone away, is, boy, I like everything he's doing. I just wish he would stop tweeting so much. He's so mean when he tweets, and they don't like that. When I say they like what he was doing, policy-wise, they like what he's doing. But I think that, but here's the thing. Here's why I find it difficult to believe that he's going to change very much, which is when he got into the primary, everybody told him he had no chance to be the Republican nominee. Guilty as charged. I didn't tell him, but I certainly said it.
You tweeted
plenty
it.
of times.
Yeah.
And then that he couldn't win. He couldn't beat Hillary. He was told that. He did it his way. It was certainly something like we've never seen before. And yet, he's in the White House, and everybody else who told him he couldn't win is not. And so, in his mind, he's been successful at everything he's touched, whether it's been as a developer. Been as a TV reality star, I guess, or whatever, or as a political candidate. So he's going to do it his way again, and I think that things are different, and it is certainly possible Democrats could nominate somebody as disliked as Hillary was, but it's also more than likely that whoever they nominate won't have the national negatives that she had built up over the many years that she's been in the public eye. Remember, in 2016, both parties nominated the two most unpopular nominees ever in American politics, going not just one unpopular, but both unpopular. Other candidates have, it took Mike Dukakis had to earn his unfavorables in the campaign, and he did. Yeah. I don't know that the Democrats are going to, I'm not going to say make that same mistake, but are going to nominate somebody with over 50% unfavorables like Hillary did. So I think it's a very tough road for the president. And, you know, he's either got to look at the polls that show him behind any Democratic nominee and say, oh, okay, I've got to make adjustments, or he's going to say, look, the polling, you know, told me I was going to lose in 2016, so screw that, full speed ahead.
Yeah, I picked that option.
Yeah.
Most people did.
Yeah. One of the things I hear, Symone, when I talk to Democrats, and this is particularly from older Black Democrats, is that America might not be ready again for a Black president or a brown president or the first woman president, and that it might take a white man at the top of the ticket to go up against Donald Trump because of the kind of racialized and polarized atmosphere we're in. What do you say to that critique?
You know, I say to that critique that I don't agree. To say, particularly when they talk about, oh, I don't think we're ready for another woman candidate. I think a woman could be at the top of the ticket in 2020 for the Democratic side of the aisle. I don't foresee two women on the ticket on the Democratic side of the aisle, but I do think that a woman or a person of color can be at the top of the ticket. I think judging particularly women and the potential for women candidates by 2016 will get us into murky waters, because I don't think Hillary Clinton is the baseline for all women, future women candidates. I think people felt like they knew what they knew about Hillary Clinton, and whether either they liked her or they hated her, and there was not a lot of room for her to grow. But I will say that, look, I think when you look at the House of Representatives, almost all of the new African-American members of Congress were elected in non-majority minority districts, meaning they were elected in majority white districts, which dispels the myth that Black or brown candidates cannot win in places without majority people of color. I think it's about a person that can win in primary. Look, the Democratic primary, Black women pick the Democratic nominee in a Democratic primary. They have. The road to a Democratic nominee goes through South Carolina, goes through the
Mississippi, Georgia.
Super Tuesday states. Yes, and if you cannot win Black women, you will not be the Democratic nominee. Now, I will say the person that I think can beat Donald Trump, Black women have to love you, and these suburban white women that everybody keeps talking about that, you know, helped deliver a historic House in 2018, white women have to like you. And we have to put up someone, in my opinion, in 2020 that can both win a primary, but also win a general election. In my opinion, it doesn't, you know, I disagree with Michael Avenatti. I'll just say that.
Yeah, that was one of his theories. Glenn, you wanted to jump in here.
Yes, I actually believed, after looking at the 2016 turnout and election results, I believe that the Democrats are better off nominating an African-American candidate. And I think the main reason for that is, and Symone touched on this when she talked about the African Americans who won in majority white districts, that what you see is, from the Democratic standpoint, you have an energized African American base that turns out at a higher rate for an African American candidate than they do for a white candidate. And then you have white Democrats saying, you know, I don't care who it is, I just want to beat the Republican, and they're proud to cast their vote for an African American. And, you know, so I think that actually the Democrats would be more problematic if they nominate a white male. And I know that's kind of what you wouldn't expect a Republican pollster to say, but when you think about it from a turnout standpoint, that's why I'm looking that way for the Democrats. Now, that doesn't mean they should follow my advice.
Kyle.
I actually got the sense during some of these House primaries in particular that when Democratic primary voters had the option to pick an African American candidate or a woman or an African American woman or whatever non-white male you want to talk about, that I think Democratic voters actually liked having that choice, and that particularly with Trump in the White House, who is sort of seen as this kind of nationalist figure and is also a person who's sort of really supported by essentially rural white voters, that Democrats look at that and almost want to go the other way, that they really want to actively put up opponents to him who basically are not white men. And I just wonder how that might play out in a primary, if in fact that is true, and that if Democratic voters don't want to nominate a white man, they're going to want to nominate someone else to provide a stark contrast to the president, and also, frankly, to reflect the demographic base of the party, which is very diverse, and also, you know, we talked about how African Americans are such a key cog in the Democratic primary machine, specifically in the South, where they're just a higher percentage of African Americans in general. But also in a lot of these primaries and caucuses, the participants are going to be 57, 58, 59% women, because just women are more Democratic than men, and therefore, and women make up a bigger share of the electorate anyway, just overall. But you are going to have primary electorates that are disproportionately women on the Democratic side, and will that be important? I think it very well could in who they'd choose.
And Maria, possible Latino candidates, Julian Castro and Beto O'Rourke is not Latino, even though some people think he is.
And he speaks Spanish.
He speaks Spanish, and some people think he's sort of an honorary Latino.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's right.
Oh, Latino.
That's right. And I think I think he would benefit from people thinking he is Latino because of Beto, because he speaks Spanish, because he's from El Paso, all of those things. And I'm sure he will use that to his advantage. But, you know, I agree that going into 2020, we do have a great opportunity to nominate a ticket that is reflective of what this country actually looks like demographically. That's not to say that demographics is destiny for the Democrats. We saw in 2016 that that is not the case. But I do think that 2016 hopefully was the last time that somebody can win by rousing up the majority white vote. And what I mean by that is that all of these communities of color, and I'm including young millennials in there because they are more multicultural than any other community, and frankly, they are also by far the biggest voting bloc, which if we could get millennials to the polls and the numbers that they actually represent, that would be incredibly historic and seismic from a political standpoint. So I think that going into 2020, Republicans do have to worry about this issue of having a complete and total block in terms of speaking relevantly with Trump at the head of the ticket to a growing multicultural communities of color voters who are becoming much more engaged, who are becoming much more outraged at how their communities are being treated. And if you combine that with, again, the white suburban women and just other decent Americans who are sick of how this president is representing them, this country, its values, not just here nationally, but also abroad, I think that you can put together a very strong winning coalition that can definitely beat Trump. Again, I'm not saying it's going to be a cakewalk. I don't think that it will. That we're going to have to nominate, you know, the right person. They're going to have the right running mate. And they cannot take anything for granted. They're actually going to have to travel to the states that are important, and just, you know, remember that nothing is in the bag, no matter what these midterms say. Going into 2020, still the name of the game is unpredictability, and we have to make sure that we speak to as many voters as we can, that we knock on as many doors as we can, and that we actually invest the money in the groups that we know are movable, that are open to our messages, and that are relevant in terms of the communities who are becoming much more politically engaged.
Go ahead, Symone. You want to jump in?
I just think that the Democratic primary in 2019-2020 will have to be robust because the Democratic nominee will need to be battle tested. And by that I mean you don't want to find out in the general election all these things that you could have found out if you just maybe had a few more debates or if somebody just did a little bit more opposition research. And I do think that this point about the economy will be really, really important. I think I saw all my weeks run together. Maybe it was last week, maybe it was Monday, but that the Republicans are looking to move, the Republicans in the House are looking to move in a lame duck session, another tax bill, particularly for middle-class Americans. They know that's what they would like to do because many people, to Kyle's point, were very unhappy with this tax bill. So much so that Republicans stopped running on it in their primaries. You saw at the beginning of the primary season, in the midterms, you saw a lot of tax bill ads and you didn't see any toward like right in the middle. And then towards the end of the general election, it was like, tax bill who? So I think that the economy is a really important sticking point. And yes, we have to do a lot of mobilization and motivation work on the Democratic side to turn out folks that are already with Democrats, many people that set out in 2016. But there is also something to be said about these Obama-Trump voters that folks talk about that accounted for about 8% of the electorate in 2016. And it might not seem like a lot, but over 50 million people voted for Donald Trump. So 8% of that electorate is important. And these Obama-Trump voters that voted for Obama in 12, voted for Trump in 2016 are gettable voters that can make up the margin and the difference. The question becomes, are the Obama-Trump voters all that, a candidate steps out onto the stage in their campaign in 2019 and says, this is who I'm running to speak to, because the other Democratic base voters are going to go along with the get along anyway. I think that's wrong to do, and any candidate that thinks they'd like to do that, I think they're asking to lose a primary. But you do need, I really believe that the midterms have shown us that you can run on the values and the things that you believe in as a Democratic candidate in this country, talk about the economy, but also address racism and sexism and ageism, look at dead in the eye, and still do well. And so the kind of candidate that is willing to speak truth to power, if you will, but can also talk about the economy and trade and business, I think is a person that can do extremely well in 2020. But I don't even know who that person is. Anybody that says so-and-so is going to be president, they are lying to you. Right. No one knows who is going to be the Democratic nominee, let alone who can beat Donald Trump. Nobody knows.
Kyle, talk about how racially polarized the electorate is now. It's almost like if, voting and party is so tied to race in a way we hadn't seen, I think, in the last cycles.
I don't necessarily know if it's new, but it certainly is a big factor in that you really would expect 75 to 80% of the non-white electorate, which is a growing part of the electorate. It's slowly every cycle it ticks up just a little bit. You'd expect that group to be voting heavily Democratic, but then there's also, and it's not a racial divide, it's an educational divide amongst white voters that has become much sharper over time, and that is white voters who do not have a four-year college degree. They were trending Republican. They've been Republican for a while, but they're getting way more Republican under Trump. And then the flip side is that you've got white college graduates, and I think this is true, and the precise numbers mean this may have been true for Obama as well in 2012, but Clinton probably was the first Democratic presidential candidate ever to kind of decisively win white college voters. And we saw in the House results that a lot of those voters voted Democratic for House too, or maybe they had voted for Trump. And then they ended up, voting Democratic for House to put a check on the White House, and so you've got this educational divide. So again, places like Virginia's 10th congressional district, right in Northern Virginia, that went from a district that Romney barely won to one that Clinton won by 10, and then threw out Barbara Comstock in basically a landslide, the Republican congresswoman. And you saw districts like that across the country, but at the same time, there are other districts that used to be kind of safe Democratic seats with that are kind of white working class districts, and those districts are increasingly coming onto the map as Republican targets, to the point where if you're trying to plot out a path for Republicans to win the House back in 2020 or in the future, a lot of the seats they just lost probably aren't really going to be targets for them in the future. It's going to be more kind of traditionally Democratic white working class places, across the Northeast and the Midwest. So again, I know you asked about race, but to me, it's not just race, divide. But it's education amongst white voters that has really become a very important factor.
Okay, Glen is going to jump in here, but if people have questions, if you want to start to line up at this microphone here too, we're gonna toss some questions out to you if anybody has any.
Yeah, I just want to make two observations along those lines. First of all, in 2016, white women with college degrees evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, 49-49. This year, they voted for the Democrats 59 to 39. Right. So a net 20-point swing. That's not sustainable for Republicans going forward, and that's one of the reasons we took such a beating in suburban districts. But even voters, white women without college degrees, went from voting Republican by 28 points to voting Republican by just 14 points. So, Republicans have a problem with white women regardless, a challenge, I should say, with white women regardless of degree or not. Obviously, college degrees are much more problematic. And also, I'm of the school that, yes, Republicans won in 2016, still hold the Senate, won a bunch of governor's races like Ohio and Florida that we were expected to lose. But I do believe that given how things are shifting in terms of the percent minority is increasing, that if you're a Republican and you don't think that Republicans need to do better with minorities, you're really bad at math and you need to go back to the chalkboard and figure that out.
Yeah, Maria, you want to jump in?
Yes, and then one other thing that we haven't really talked about is the mythical independent voter, right? They do still exist, and Trump won them. I think it was by 12 points in 2016, and he lost them by 9 or something in 2018, or Republicans lost them by something like that in 2018. And so again, so they lost them by 12. He had won them.
By 9, is that?
By 9 and 20.
Somebody has Googled
anyway,
this.
he won them in 2016. Republicans lost them in 2018. If you take independent voters, college-educated suburban white women voters together, along with all of the growing multicultural communities that are voting overwhelmingly against Trump and Republicans, to Glen's point, that is not a sustainable trend for Republicans.
I'm gonna go to you, but I want to quickly ask you this, Symone. You talked about speaking truth to power in terms of race and calling out Republicans or Trump when he plays the race card. Do you see any perils in that? Right. I mean, one of the theories of the Gillum race, for instance, and he did call out DeSantis on some of the comments he made that were racially charged. One of the theories is that he did that too much. Maybe he went too far in speaking truth to power on the issue of race. How does the party deal with that? How does the next Democratic sort of lot of candidates deal with the way that I think Donald Trump, in dealing with race, he I think destabilizes some of these candidates. If you think about what Elizabeth Warren ended up doing with the DNA test, because he was calling her a terrible nickname, and she may have blown up her chances to be
definitely
president.
Tripped. She definitely ran up to the line and tripped when it was time to perform. Look, I think, let me say something very specific about the Gillum race that I don't think people understand. And the consultants that worked on Ron DeSantis' race will say this to you, that Andrew Gillum's campaign was not ready to win the primary in terms of they did not have the necessary infrastructure in place to win and then be able to go to win. They didn't have the necessary infrastructure in place to win a general election. They did not have staff in some places. They did not have, they were not knocking doors. They did not have a field operation in places where they should have had a field operation, and Ron DeSantis did. They got outworked on the campaign trail. And so the idea that Andrew Gillum lost because he took on some of the things Ron DeSantis said directly, I think is untrue, because he also talked about the climate change. It was a big issue in the Florida race. They talked specifically about health care. But the reason I fully believe, and others believe, that Andrew Gillum is currently not the governor, is because they didn't have the infrastructure and they didn't scale up. And frankly, the DGA didn't come in and overlay that infrastructure.
Okay.
That being said, I do think that much like in 2016, it wasn't enough to just say Donald Trump is bad. You have to, we need to vote for me. It is not enough to say that Donald Trump is a racist or is in bed with white supremacists or whatever people say, and that is why I should be the Democratic nominee for president, or that is why you should vote for me to beat Donald Trump. I think you have to have a message, but you cannot, in my opinion, run against Donald Trump or even run a race in this day and age without addressing the issue of race, of ethnicity across this country. And I think that there are real, authentic ways to do that. I think why Elizabeth Warren tripped at the finish line is because she tried to play Donald Trump's game. It's been shown that you can't play Donald Trump's game and win. He plays it better than anybody else. So what she should have done is say, look, I know Trump Trump wants to make this about me. I took this DNA test, but this is really about the Native people. And when she rolled out that video, she should have rolled out a video of her on a reservation talking about the plight of Native people and the fight that they are still having in this day and age. That's how you elevate the conversation.
All righty. Sir.
Well, thank you so much. One of the things you mentioned was the massive changes in state executives, but also the massive increase in Democrats in state legislatures. How will that increase of nearly 400 Democrats in state legislatures affect the redistricting in 2020 and beyond?
Who wants to take that?
I'll start and then you can. So that's a great point, because that is another place where Democrats are kind of giddy, because during the Obama years, we lost almost 1,000 state legislative seats and lost governorships. And as we have seen, that has had a huge impact on all of these issues that also have impacted races like voter rules, guidelines, voter suppression. All of that is done at the state level. And redistricting, to your point. And so the fact that Democrats were able to make some of that up to a third, we won 350 state legislative seats, flipped 7 chambers, that's a huge deal. Excuse me, because I think that underscores, again, that Democratic wins weren't just at the top, but they sunk in to where they really matter, where all of the legislation is made at the state level that will ultimately guide how elections are run, even though we have seen there's still huge holes and challenges in a lot of these states. And we saw it play out in Georgia, for example, with the huge voter suppression that took place. And I agree, if that had not been present, Stacey Abrams would probably be governor today. And so that is a huge point of importance for Democrats, and underscoring how important it is to continue these wins on the state legislative level.
Thank you.
Does anybody, I kind of want to get.
I'm sorry, I cannot let the Georgia baloney pass without responding. A couple of things. First of all, record turnout. Secondly, 30% of the state is African-American, 30% of the votes were cast by African-Americans. If Republicans are so good at voter suppression, or doing voter suppression, they're not very good at it. The 100,000 people who were purged, first of all, that law exists in many states. For it to happen, you have to have not voted in 3 consecutive elections. Then you get a letter, and if you don't vote in the next 2 elections, then you're purged. So it's not like you're, and guess what? A lot of those people are dead. And I know those who may be from Chicago think there's nothing wrong with that, but the rest of the country, that's a problem, letting dead people vote. So that's one thing. Also, the 53,000 on the list who did not have proper ID, originally they were given 2 years to fix that, to go in and fix that. And then on election day, all you had to do was show up with a proper ID. And, you know, every time I vote in Virginia, I have to show ID. So, you know, the whole thing about voter suppression, when you had record turnout and the highest number of African Americans ever voting, that's just, I mean, look, here's the reason Stacey Abrams is so adamant that there was voter suppression. The reason is she was told that, oh, we're hitting all of our metrics, we're going to win. We're hitting all of our targets. Just like John Kerry was told about Ohio, we're hitting all of our targets. What they didn't understand was that Republicans had great turnout operations in their base and turned out the Democrats, and that's why
this is going to be a real fight.
If I could just say one thing about,
what can I tell you?
If I could just say one thing about the efforts to curb access to the ballot box across the country, efforts that I work on under the Priorities USA Foundation, I'll say particularly when it comes to Georgia. When you're requiring people to have driver's license and all these other things, if the Secretary of State's office in that state does not participate in a robust voter information campaign, that is why people cry, quote unquote, voter suppression. Because if you mandate people to have driver's licenses and all of these other things, but you are not actively putting dollars into a media campaign, but also literally a mini, like actual campaign, sometimes door knocking, whatever it is it takes, to to make sure the electorate understands what is required of them when they go to the ballot box, particularly when so many new people have registered to vote through through efforts of an organization, not through efforts that the Secretary of State's office has put forward. That is where some of these issues come in. And you can look at Iowa as an example.
Terry McAuliffe and Ralph Northam have never contacted me and told me I need to bring voter ID.
Well, neither one of those were the Secretary of State. So I do believe that it is very important that folks understand that since 2016, more than 35 states have introduced more than 150 bills to curb access to the ballot box across this country. It's not just in places like Georgia. It's in Iowa. It's in Florida. It's in New Hampshire. It's in places to say that you can vote with a gun license, but not with the student ID. That is a real issue that we need to address. But I know it's not for this panel.
Yeah,
Well,
we can.
I'll just underscore very
quickly, Maria.
I vote in D.C. In D.C., you do not have to show a voter ID card at all. So I would posit that in any place where you actually have to show a voter ID, they are exercising voter suppression, plain and simple. Because in order to get a voter ID, there are massive communities of color who do not have access to a government ID, whether it's because of money, whether it's because they don't have the records to show it. That is voter suppression.
Okay, ma'am.
Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I have running for public office since '94. Several times of U.S. Senate and several times of U.S. Congress. One time of Maryland State Comptroller, and also run for Rockland City Mayors and Maryland State Senate. But I don't think you can see my name sort of anywhere except probably votemd.org, which is a nonprofit website. And so for me, I think democracy is not determined by really whether you can change the wave, blue wave or red wave or whatever. I think democracy should means everybody can have their voice heard and we can build a better system. Like currently, it's a administration after administration, it's just there's nothing changed. I think you say the system is rigged, election is rigged, and that's true. You cannot just say the voter number, but you have to be more concerned about who are not going to vote and whether their lives are improved. Currently, we just say racism or racial profiling is not good enough. Currently, a lot of elderly are victimized.
Yeah.
So if we can change the system to benefit general public, to protect everybody, their rights, their life, their properties, their document. Now you are saying that the cyber attack is by Russian or now saying by China. I think we have to consider within our domestic first. Because a lot of hacking is by
we want to try to get to as many questions, but I think one of the,
it's not just by who go to vote. Democracy is that everybody should be protected. Everybody should have a voice heard, so you can see not one against those people who control our life in a wrong way. We have to have a general public to say we sympathize everybody who is hurting by somebody else.
Okay, ma'am, thank you. I mean, she's getting at, this sense that people don't feel a part of the system, they don't feel like their voices are heard, which in some ways is what Donald Trump was able to tap into, at least in 2016. Does anybody want to kind of comment?
Well,
Kyle?
I will say that I think the fact that the turnout was just so high in this election. 50% roughly of people who are eligible to vote actually showed up, which is an extraordinarily high number. Usually, you'd think at a midterm, 40% is pretty decent, but 50% is, and so that Glen sort of made this point, and I'm not going to get into the Georgia matter, which has been thoroughly discussed on this panel. But I will say that, you did have a lot of people exercising their right to vote in this election. And I think there are some concerning things about this particular era of American politics, but it is generating a lot of interest in politics and a lot of people are participating.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am.
So our system, the fact that you're talking about Republicans and Democrats and who's going to be each primary candidate coming up, highlights the fact that our system is, at least the major parties are advantaged in our system. So my question is how you feel about the prospects of in this time of apparently increasing polarity between the two parties, a centrist third-party candidate arising, not necessarily to win, traditionally they don't, but as you might call it, a spoiler, and how does that play into your respective party strategies?
Who wants to take that?
I'll touch on it. Look, I think it's very difficult because the two parties are built for survival. And the example I always like to give is Ross Perot in 1992 took a huge chunk of voters. By the way, to any Republicans who might be in the audience, Ross Perot did not cost George H.W. Bush that election. The bad economy is what did that. Perot running actually helped Republicans down ticket because it gave people a chance to express their disappointment, unhappiness with the incumbent president, and then still vote Republican on the congressional level. And what you saw then after that was going into 1994, Republicans, as the out party, were particularly adept at taking a lot of what Ross Perot talked about and kind of incorporating that into their messaging. So I think that the two parties, yes, there are structural difficulties for a third-party candidate, but I also think from a survival standpoint, when the parties feel threatened, they expand or adapt in a way that sort of takes the oxygen out of the room for a third-party candidate. Doesn't mean the third-party candidates won't have an impact in 2020, for example, but it is hard to see it as a sustaining long-term thing that's going to last more than one or even two cycles.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
And next question?
Yes, mine is in regards to Georgia.
Here we go.
In regarding to voter ID and voter suppression, and I think that's insulting to people of color, black people who are saying that they cannot get ID. You have to have ID to go to open up an account. You have to have an ID to get on a plane. You have to have an ID to do anything. And you're insulting when you say that a person of color or someone can't vote because they do not have an ID. I think that's extremely insulting. Also, I think that in terms of labeling, I personally have people that live in Georgia. Matter of fact, College Park and Atlanta, Stone Mountain as well. And they did not vote for Stacey Abrams because they felt that she did not represent what their values were. They felt that her vote, her values did not represent JFK. Whatever happened to JFK's, his incredible speech about ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. The Democratic Party is looking to people for give me, give me, give me. What about self-reliance? What about getting out there and making it for yourself?
Okay, who wants? Thank you, ma'am. Who wants to? Who knows the most about Georgia?
I'm going to speak in general about efforts to about voting rights efforts. So part of the work that I do with Priorities USA is I work with the Priorities USA Foundation, and the Priorities USA Foundation is one of the largest funders of voting rights litigation in the country. And so over the last year and a half, we have supported and/or brought litigation in Missouri, New Hampshire, Iowa, Florida. Just to name a few, in terms of making sure that access to the ballot box is open to everyone, regardless of your political party or your political leanings. And for an example, in Florida, we had to sue in Florida because the Secretary of State, Mr. Detzner, said that college campuses were not eligible to serve as early vote locations. It was his interpretation of a law that was passed in the state legislature that although they expanded what was considered an early vote location, that college campuses did not fall under that purview. Well, if you know anything about Florida, there's a lot of college campuses in Florida. And there are a lot of young people that are actually registered to vote in Florida, and if their college campus was an early vote location, they would be able to vote there. So we sued and we said that was a bad interpretation of the law and it violated Floridians' constitutional rights, their constitutional voting rights, and we won. Similar thing happened in Iowa with a voter ID bill. Our issue that we sued on and said that, look, it's not that we're saying, folks can't get ID. We're saying that we have to sue because the Secretary of State's office has not done their due diligence in explaining to the voters or potential voters about what they need to do under this purview. So I think that it is very important for folks to understand that since the gutting of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, that there has been no oversight in terms of laws that affect the right to vote. And so previously, before that, if you changed the law that had something to do with someone's ability to go to the ballot box, there was oversight from the Department of Justice. Since the gutting of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, there now is no oversight. So there's no one to put a check on any legislature or any Secretary of State or any governor across this country outside of individual litigation to say, hey, this law might disenfranchise someone. So because of the history of America, because that many people had to pay poll taxes and pass tests to be able to cast their right to vote, I think we have to do a little bit more work to make sure that we are not impeding access to the ballot box for anyone.
All righty. Sir?
So I'm here with my class today, sitting over there, and
Hey, class.
we have a recurring debate in our class about whether or not America is more polarized than it has been in the past. So I've heard the debate come up a little bit on the panel, and personally, just give my views that I think that we are surely polarized, but not as much as people say, or not more than the past. And my question to the panel is, what do you guys think about that?
Who wants to take this? Kyle, can you sort of look at the data of this?
I think I mentioned this much earlier, that we have a pretty low percentage of House districts that vote for a different party for president and also for the House. So to put some historical perspective in it, in the 1976 presidential election, so 40 years ago, also a race that was very close, decided by 2 points nationally, just like our most recent one, about a little less than 30% of all the House districts voted for one party for president and the other party for House. In the most recent presidential election, it was more like 8% of all the House districts. Now, that isn't unprecedented, though, because if you go back 100 years to when American politics, after the Civil War and into the 20th century, basically, if you look at the electoral map, it kind of looks like the Civil War being fought out all over again. You had a Democratic South, you had a Republican North, and then some of the swing states of the Midwest, like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, that were sort of both northern and southern, helped decide those elections. But back then, you also didn't have that much many split tickets either. I am inclined to think that we are very polarized. I also do think, though, that, and Maria was talking about this a little bit, that there is a significant share of independent voters, and they are willing to split their tickets. And I think a lot of them maybe voted for Trump and then voted Democratic for House. So I think that's something that's worth noting.
Thanks. I think we just have time for one more question. Ma'am?
Ms. Cardona, this is for you specifically. Actually, I have one question and then one statement. In the very beginning, you made a statement that's troubled me since I've been sitting here. Can you tell me what 2016 PTSD is? If you have PTSD, if you're familiar with PTSD, and can you define it for me?
So what I meant, and maybe I should not have used that term because I understand that is a very serious condition. So I apologize for using that term, but what I meant was that we have a lot of bad lingering memories about what we thought the outcome of that election was, and it wasn't.
Do you understand that PTSD is a very serious condition?
Yes,
I'm a
that's
veteran.
why I just said
I'm also
that.
an ex-police
Yes.
officer.
So I apologize for having used that
Okay, it's
term.
a very serious condition. Please don't water that down and just credit the people that deal with it and suffer from it every day.
Understood.
Okay.
Yes.
The second thing is, I'm also with this group, a class from over here. I don't tend to identify with one group or the other, Republican or Democratic. I'm much more complicated than the labels that you guys want to put on us. I feel that a lot of polarization that you guys speak of is coming from you guys. You guys constantly mention racism. You constantly mention xenophobia. You mention, white women versus white men and African-American women, Latino women. If you look at me, can you tell me, let me explain. I grew up in a rural community, I'm like a little shaky here, primarily white people. Can you tell me what my family is composed of?
What your what?
What my family is composed of. Can you tell me who's in my family?
No.
Can you tell me what race I am?
No.
Can you tell that my grandkids are both Puerto Rican and black, and that I live in a community that is, primarily white, and I'm familiar with racism? it's often very watered down, and it's forced down our throats. The other thing that bothers me is that we talk about education and how educated people tend to vote Democratic. Could that possibly be that when our kids are in college, it's forced down their throats? Could that be? And that
What's
kids
forced
are
down their throats?
just, push towards, the Democratic Party, just kind of, there's always a push for that. It is. It's a very liberal environment, our colleges today. And, I don't know if you guys remember who you work for. You guys work for us. You guys are there for us, not the other way around. And I think your agendas are the focus, not the people that you work for, because you don't speak for us. You don't speak for this white woman that lives in, a rural community. You don't speak for me. You don't know who I voted for.
I never
well,
said
not you
that I did.
specifically, but just, across the board. It just
Sure.
happens.
Anybody want to?
Yeah, let me just address that, because and everybody should jump in here, when we talk about demographics, we're not assuming anything. We are looking at the actual data that has come out from elections themselves, from people who self-identify as the demographics that we are talking about. We're not making it up out of thin air. Okay.
My Puerto Rican
we
family
also
votes Republican.
And we
just
also
so you
don't.
know.
We also don't do it out of assuming anything. Again, this is all very data-driven. When we talk about white college-educated voters, when we talk about rural voters, when we talk about non-college educated voters, those are actual groups that are used when you accumulate data. Now, I will say, from a personal standpoint, I am a Latina. And I have been the target of rancid racism just because of what I talk about on television and because I call out racism when I see it.
Maybe you're calling it racism and it's not really, because I couldn't tell you're Latino.
And when I talk about racism and xenophobia from this president is because it is real, and the communities that feel it, they feel it personally. They feel attacked personally. Their children feel attacked personally. When I see Latino kids who are crying in school because other children are talking to them about how they should be deported and how they are anchor babies, I'm sorry, that's racism and that's xenophobia.
We're going to have to end it here. This has been a great debate. I thank Glen, Maria, Kyle, Symone, and all of you for coming and all of you for your questions.
And thank you, Nia.
Thanks, guys.
Well, I see more of my students got here and saved their C's. Not seats, C's. I thought it would take a while for you to catch on to that. Anyway, I'm glad you're finally here. So you told me you left at 5:30. I hope eventually you'll tell me the truth. But anyway, that was a great panel. I thought they did a terrific job. Give them another round of applause, please. And I hope they heard it. Okay, I am really, really delighted to welcome our next guest, Senator Ted Cruz. He appeared in my 101 class, introductory class to American politics a number of years ago in Charlottesville, and it's a big class, it's 400 or some. As many of them call it, because it meets at 3 p.m., they call it nap time when I'm teaching it. But when Senator Cruz came, they stayed awake the whole hour, which really was remarkable. The entire auditorium stayed awake, and they gave it a high rating, and they enjoyed it tremendously because he's a dynamic speaker and he kept them very interested. His former staffer, I think is AA, Chip Roy, who was a student of mine at UVA, was just elected to Congress from Texas. So we're going to have him down to the university as well. Anyway, Senator Cruz has been, I think some of you know him. You're going to be surprised at his appearance. I was shocked. He has decided to take on the hippie look from the 1960s, and you'll see what I mean when he comes out. You want to take photos, this could be worth something. I've heard the National Enquirer has a great interest in the Cruz family. Does anybody get that? I guess not. He's too young, I suppose, to remember the 2016 election, and don't you remember? Okay, well, I thought this was a politically interested group. Anyway, He has been a United States Senator from Texas since 2013. He was, of course, recently reelected, and we were just talking about the race, extremely tough race. Republicans had tough races all over the country, and he had one in particular. He may tell you some of the reasons why. It was 2.5 points. He won. One voter a million, you get the seat for 6 years. So he's got the seat for 6 years. He's long been a star. He was a graduate of Princeton. He has a law degree from Harvard. He didn't need any safety schools, okay? We started with that joke this morning. You didn't laugh that time either, the ones who were here. So I guess you don't know what that is either. Senator Cruz was Solicitor General of Texas from 2003 to 2008. He was the first Hispanic Solicitor General in Texas, the youngest Solicitor General in the United States, and the longest serving Solicitor General in Texas history. So this is really his second major elective office, or public position, one appointed and one elected. And I think you're going to find him fascinating and also very frank. He indicated that he doesn't want to speak very long. He wants to take your questions. So be thinking of good questions, particularly the students, because you have a chance to get a C+. You really do. You know, if you ask a really good question, it could go up to C+. And that's a big difference. You appreciate that, don't you? Could be the difference between your 4th place school and your 5th place school for graduate school. So I want you to keep that in mind. That was another joke, but you're just not responding. And I'm glad we didn't pay for a lunch for you. Please join me in welcoming Senator Ted Cruz.
Well, thank you, Larry. Good morning. It is good to be with you. Thank you guys for coming out. It is great to be here and part of this discussion on the 20th Annual American Democracy Conference. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. Those are the words that Charles Dickens begins A Tale of Two Cities with. And I think those words describe in many ways where the American political process is right now today. We are seeing on substance, on policy, I think very significant victories for the American people. If you look at how the economy is going right now. The economic picture, a few months ago, the New York Times wrote, "It is impossible to say enough good things about these job numbers," which you know it was painful for the New York Times to write those words. But if you look at our economic prospects right now, we've got the lowest unemployment in decades. We've got the lowest African American unemployment that's ever been recorded. We've got the lowest Hispanic unemployment that has ever been recorded. We have the lowest Asian American unemployment that's ever been recorded. We have the lowest unemployment for women in 70 years. And we have the lowest unemployment for young people in 52 years. We've got a lot of students here, a lot of young people who will be coming out of school, hopefully getting jobs. Those are encouraging times when you see the economy booming. And I believe the reason the economy is booming is as a direct result of cutting taxes and cutting job-killing regulations. On the policy side, I think we've seen very positive steps forward. When it comes to national security and foreign policy, I think we've also seen very strong steps forward. I think America today is standing more closely with our friends and allies, and we have been defeating our enemies. That is a strong position for the country to be in. At the same time, today is a deeply divided time in our country. There's an anger, there's a rage that I think isn't healthy. I think it isn't good for our country. The anger that we're seeing, we saw it in this last election, I think we'll see it in 2020. That anger and rage tearing us apart corrodes our democracy. How it plays out in the next 2 years, I don't know. We had an election where both sides were happy at some of the results. Democrats were hoping for a giant blue wave. Some Republicans were hoping for a giant red wave. And we ended up with a little bit of both. The Senate side, Republicans increased our majority from 51 to 53. At the same time, we lost the House of Representatives. I think what that's likely to yield for the next 2 years is a deeply divided and, sadly, I fear, even paralyzed Congress. In the House, I think the Democrats have unleashed some of the angriest voices on the left. I think we're going to see 2 years of investigations, of subpoenas, and we may well see impeachment. I think that anger and rage is going to have to burn out some more before we can come together and enact major legislative reforms that we should be doing. From my perspective, what I hope to spend a lot of the next 2 years doing, certainly doing what I can to continue legislating. The last 2 years have been incredibly productive, but we've had Republican Houses and Senates. My optimism level is diminished for how much productivity we're going to have with divided government. So much of the next 2 years, from my perspective, I want to focus on moving people's hearts and minds, on talking about substance and issues. And one thing I would encourage to each of you, look, there are people in this room that have a whole variety of political views. That's a wonderful thing. Let me encourage each of you to embrace civil discourse, to embrace discussions of ideas. You know, last year, I did 3 different CNN debates with Bernie Sanders. We did 1 on health care, 2 on tax policy. Each of those was 90 minutes long. They were town halls. In those 90-minute debates, the one we did on health care, there was more substance on health care policy in that 90-minute debate than I promise you in the entire presidential campaign. Like the presidential campaign, you have debates where everyone speaks for about 60 seconds on a topic. It is not difficult for someone to read their talking points for 60 seconds. And you get very little depth or substance in that kind of format. And one of the reasons why I was glad to do those town halls with CNN, I was glad Bernie agreed to do them, is that the debates were on issues, they were on substance, they were on what works. And we can have real, meaningful discussions about what policies are successful. You know, there's a tendency in political discourse to demonize your opponents, to caricature your opponents, to think of anyone who disagrees with you, well, they've either got to be stupid or evil. Those are the 2 options. Either they're not smart enough to know the right answer, they're just blithering morons, or even worse, they are smart enough to know the right answer and they just want people to suffer. And if you want to see that phenomenon on full display, all you have to do is go on Twitter. And Twitter has an odd effect of sort of throwing gasoline on the fire and amplifying the extremes, where people will say bitter and nasty things on Twitter that they'd never say to an actual real live human being in front of them. But here's the real truth of it. Most people are neither stupid nor evil. Years ago, about, 10 years ago or so, I was invited to give the commencement address at Berkeley, at their school of government. And at the time, this was long before I was elected to the Senate, I'd been Solicitor General of Texas, which is the chief lawyer for the state, in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was actually kind of funny how I got the invitation, which, me giving a commencement at Berkeley is not a natural place you would expect to find me. And the backstory, as I understood it, was that the head of their government department looked and said, gosh, every one of our speakers has been liberal Democrats over and over and over again. Maybe we should have someone from the other side of the aisle. But they didn't really know anyone from the other side of the aisle. And so as I understand it, the head of the department called a government professor at University of Texas, figured, all right, you're in Texas, you got to know a Republican. And so he called the professor and he said, well, look, you know, the guy we had last year, I'd given the commencement address at UT's government department the year before. He said, he did an all right job. Why don't you ask him? So suddenly I get the invitation. Now, it's interesting. As I said, it was about 10 years ago. I remember it was the very dawn of Facebook. It was like right when Facebook was starting to exist. And my going there prompted protests. There was a group, I still remember, it was 93 students who formed a Facebook group protesting that the school had destroyed their education by inviting this horrible, horrible person to address them. And, you know, I thought a long time about what to say in that scenario. Now, you know, we had the protest. My wife's comment at the time was, Heidi was exactly right. She said, good God, you're not nearly important enough to protest. Like, thank you, dear. So I thought a lot about what to say, and I decided to give a speech on diversity, but intellectual diversity. And, you know, there's a lot of discussion in the academic world about diversity on everything except on ideas. And the message that I wanted to convey is, listen, don't fall into, keep the passion that many of you have right now. As I pointed out, Berkeley has a long, long tradition of active, passionate civil engagement. I said, don't let go of that passion. Don't let go of your zeal, the fire in your belly to change the world. Keep that desire. Don't just settle into middle-aged mediocrity. Keep the burning desire to make a difference in your community, to make a difference in the world. But learn to engage with people understanding that someone can disagree with you, how someone can take the issue that you care most passionately about, that animates you to your bones, and someone of good intelligence and good morals and good conscience can look at that issue you care the most about and arrive upon a conclusion 180 degrees opposite of your own. How your mother could reach that position. And the point I said is, look, if you ever hope to persuade anybody, whether in law or politics or business or life, you've got to understand, you've got to take people from where they are and then treat them with civility, with decency, with respect. That's why I like those Bernie Sanders debates, because look, if we're talking about, if we agree that everyone wants to see people live a better life, then we can talk about what policies are most likely to produce that. And we can have a debate, for example, about are high taxes or low taxes better for people's lives? What are the results in the economy? What are the results in families? And we can talk about that and have actually an intelligent conversation. If, on the other hand, we immediately go to, you're an evil, stinking bastard, you don't tend to have many productive conversations about how to solve a problem. And so that's something I would encourage each of you is as we look at democracy, to think about democracy as designed to have conflicts. Here's an interesting point, by the way. You know, gridlock is not a bug, it's a feature. Our checks and balances system, if you go back and read Madison's Federalist 10, he talked about factions. He said we will always have factions, what we'd call special interests today. And from Madison's perspective, the most dangerous thing was for one faction to seize control of government and to unify against the people, that he saw that as a threat to our liberty. And so Congress was designed so that the different factions would battle each other, would check and balance each other, and that in turn would protect the liberties of the people. So that conflict, that disagreement is part of the system. It's healthy. But it also takes a degree of restraint. I remember when I was in college, I was a college debater, so yes, I was one of the cool kids. And in college, I was chairman of the Conservative Party in the Debating Society. A very good friend of mine was the leader of the Liberal Party in the Debating Society. So we would debate every week on all sorts of different topics. And, you know, we'd go have a debate, and then afterwards we'd go out, you know, I'd call him a communist, he'd call me a fascist, and we'd go get a beer. And that's actually, there's, I think, some life wisdom in that. Of don't take yourself so damn seriously. That's part of how you can have a debate and a discussion about what works, is if every position that someone that disagrees with you is offensive to your soul, just like relax, count to 10. And try to begin with the assumption that we're trying to solve problems together. That won't always work. We're going to have disagreements. That's fine. But have the discussions be on issues, on substance, and what works. I think that is the right way to approach politics. I think we're seeing relatively little of that nationally. Look, one of the things I was grateful for in Texas, we had one hell of a race. But I was grateful that race focused on issues and substance and policy, and the policy agenda that I laid out was markedly different from the policy agenda of my opponent. And we had a debate with the people of Texas about what policies work. I think that's the way politics is meant to operate, and I hope we see more of that. With that, why don't I open it up? I'm happy to just take questions. So his question was, he says he works in healthcare. Fabulous. His question was, he says he works in healthcare, and he asked, what is my assessment? Is there any likelihood of a bipartisan agreement on healthcare in the next 2 years? And sadly, I think the answer is no. On healthcare, my view, look, again, how you discuss healthcare matters. I think everybody wants to see people have access to quality health care. There are debates about how you get that to happen. I believe what you want to see is as many people as possible able to afford private health insurance. That if you look at the outcomes, the best health outcomes are those that have private health insurance. And I think the key to expanding access is lowering premiums. One of the worst consequences, one of the most harmful consequences of Obamacare is that it has made premiums skyrocket. Average families' premiums have increased over $5,000 a year under Obamacare. That is an enormous challenge. Now, how do you lower premiums? Economics 101. If you want prices to go down, you want more competition, more choices, more options, more consumer freedom. I think those are the reforms that we ought to be enacting. Now, there are people who disagree. Bernie Sanders disagrees. He wants to see what he calls Medicare for all. He wants to see single-payer, socialized medicine. I think that's a terrible idea. For people interested in this, Bernie and I had a 90-minute debate going back and forth on socialized medicine. Does it work? What are the results? So if you're interested in 90 minutes of that, I won't give you 90 minutes of it right now. But you can Google it and watch the debate online, and that's, you can have a real discussion about, is this a good policy solution for people's health care needs? Now, the problem is we are so politically divided, particularly on issues like health care, that I think the chances of any meaningful health care legislation passing a Republican Senate and a Democratic House are all but zero. It remains the biggest unfinished commitment of the Republican majorities. As you know, last year we had a big extended debate that I was very, very active and involved in, and at the end of the day, Republicans fell one vote short of delivering on the promise to repeal Obamacare. Now, Nobody ever said just repeal. It was always repeal and replace with a system that drove down premiums and made health care more affordable for more people. That's the objective, but I think it's going to take at least another election to get there. I don't think we're going to see it in the next 2 years. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Li Yang. I hope I'm not very offensive, but I would like to say this. Have you heard I kill all the lawyers?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. And now the next thing is I never seen a lawyer really do a good job in America. Okay, and the next thing is I just wonder if you heard the debaters or the lawyers, the problem is they conceal the weakness but just attack the opponents, maybe by your strengths, but that's not really helpful to the nation. Okay, now my question is every time, everywhere, from local to federal to legislation, I've been provide many information. How are we going to change the system? Because I have been victimized, and my family has been victimized. And so I just send all those whole big pack of paper, but there's just going nowhere. Basically, you know, the racial profiling is not the black or brown issues. It's basically from those, what do you say, maybe bad and evil. And maybe law enforcement, maybe FBI, really, in some way, Trump has some point, so he can attack every agencies, because no agency is doing their job. So that's the way, if you say that health care is not working, you just analyze a small portion, but actually there's a big portion of problem, because let's say, for instance, law enforcement who attack the black actually can be white, it can be elderly, it can be your parents. The problem is they send them to, they attack them, they brutalize them, maybe murder them, whether by gun or by medicine or injection, or hospitalized or in rehab center. The problem with all this is not they send the bill to the patients. That means the defenders or the general public. So that's the way we waste a lot of money. So all the agency is doing this bad and evil job. So we based on this. But that's our national issues. We have to say it. Please, my question, I have to let him understand it. That's why you are the one the problem.
Ask the question.
Now, my question is, would you be able to go to back, because my complaint or issues are lost somewhere, and I have a case of employment, go to the Supreme Court, and attorney in the government is doing the bad excuses. So I had to go twice and go down, remain again. So I should have a job reinstated. But it still go nowhere. And they go their case. And now all my assets are taken away. So how are you going to let people go have a good living? So both parties are not.
So ma'am, thank you for your question. There are a lot of different aspects you touched there. Let me, I have to say, you started off with a couple of lawyer jokes. And that's all right. When I was in college, I wrote a paper that began, "What do you call 500 lawyers at the bottom of the sea? A good start." Although as much fun as those are to tell, by the way, since not to just pick on lawyers, does anyone know an accountant joke? I know precisely one accountant joke. The only accountant joke I know, which is, how do you tell an extroverted accountant? An extroverted accountant. He looks at your shoes when he's talking to you. Look, there are a great many lawyer jokes, and actually lawyers tend to know a lot of lawyer jokes. But that being said, and there's a lot of reasons to have fun and laugh at lawyers, but I'll tell you, I actually think the legal system, the American legal system we have, is a wonderful system. It's a system designed to vindicate people's rights. Ma'am, you talked about government agencies that are violating your rights. You talked about being targeted. Look, that happens. That is one of the reasons why the framers of our Constitution were so skeptical of government power. Thomas Jefferson referred to the Constitution as chains to bind the mischief of government, because unchecked power is a threat to the liberties of the people. And so I believe, number one, we should have a legal system where there are lawyers who can represent you, who can fight to vindicate your rights. But we should also have protections to protect the civil liberties of Americans. And so that, in a particular case, sometimes the way people vindicate them, if they are being persecuted, and I've represented clients who are on the receiving end of unfair government abuse. The way you press back against that is you go and defend your rights, and you fight for your rights, and you prevail in a court of law. So there's a mechanism for doing that. I can tell you in Texas, I have an extensive staff in the state of Texas that does nothing but constituent service, that they do all day long. Their job is they answer the phone calls from Texans who are dealing with the federal government in some capacity. They're dealing with the VA. They're dealing with Social Security. They're dealing with some aspect of the federal government, and it's frustrating, it's maddening, it's bureaucratic. And our constituent service team, what they do each and every day is they try to help Texans navigate through that world. And we can't solve every problem, but their job every day, and it's a completely nonpartisan endeavor, doesn't matter what party you are. If you're a Texan and you call and we can help you, we try to help you. So I think we need to have a system that protects people's rights and that values each person and their civil liberties. So thank you, ma'am.
The Senate
Bring here's
only 10 minutes until
Okay.
the vote of the Senate.
I'll make it a quick one.
Really close, really quick. I mean,
So, considering you upset David Dewhurst in 2012, and we saw similar primary upsets this year, both on the left with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and stuff like that, you talked about diversity of ideas. Do you think that these primary upsets help enforce this diversity of ideas in the Senate and House, or do you think it may hinder that?
Look, it's a great question. I think primaries, I think vigorous debates are wonderful things. Now, look, I mean, I have been a candidate for public office. I'll confess to having a not entirely unbiased view. I thought my primary victory over David Dewhurst was terrific. I thought Trump's primary victory over me wasn't nearly as great. So, you know, sometimes your perspective depends on where you're standing. But look, the reason we have primaries, I think having a diversity of views, a diversity of opinions, and a real debate is good and healthy and productive. And so we're seeing, on the Democratic side, the energy is on the far left. Now, that worries me what that means for the country, but that's clearly where the heat and anger and energy is coming from. And I think that's part of our democratic process. And we ought to be having discussions about whether the policy proposals being put forth are good or bad. But that's what our whole system is designed to do.
Thank you, Senator.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Hi, Senator Cruz. First of all, as a Cuban American, always happy to see more Cubans in the Senate and in government. What I would like to know is you were the Republican that's come closest to being beaten in Texas since 1994. It was a tough race. How are you going to represent the 48% of Texans that voted against you, and if not necessarily against you, for things like tougher gun policies, not a tax bill that benefits the rich, comprehensive climate change policies, all the things that Beto O'Rourke's campaign fought for and represented? Are you going to take those ideas into consideration when you go back to the Senate?
So thank you for that question. Let me talk about two pieces. Let me talk first about the race and the results there, and then let me talk about the second piece that you asked about the substance and the diversity of opinions. What we saw in Texas this election was truly unprecedented. We saw, number one, we saw money flooding into the state of Texas, over $80 million on the other side. Consequence of that, my campaign was outspent 3-1. Now, that has some real practical consequences. I'll give you one of the practical consequences. My campaign had a total of 18 paid full-time campaign staffers. The O'Rourke campaign had 805 paid campaign staffers. 18 to 805. That's what happens when you're being outspent 3-1, is that money gets... I would have loved to have had 800 paid staffers, but we didn't have the money to do that. That was, I think, in many ways a manifestation of the divided time we have, of the anger that is on the left. And we're seeing, and this is happening across the country, but it happened especially in Texas, massive Democratic fundraising because people are ticked off. Anger is a powerful motivator for fundraising and also for turnout, that when people are ticked off, if you go back to 2010, when Obama was president, we just passed Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, a lot of folks on the right were ticked off. And we saw a tidal wave election where Republicans took the House in a massive election. It's because that's where the anger was. We're seeing in some ways a mirror image of that. The consequence in Texas, to understand what happened, Democrats increased their turnout more than 100%. In 2014, the last off-cycle election, 1.8 million Democrats statewide in Texas showed up. This year, 4 million Democrats showed up. An increase of 2.2 million Democratic votes. That is a massive, it's a greater than 100% increase in turnout. Now, look, that was a threat I took seriously from the beginning. Indeed, I said across the state, I said, look, the far left is going to crawl over broken glass to vote in this November. We're going to see record-breaking turnout, so I viewed my job to turn everyone else out. If you didn't want to see policy choices going in that direction, then it took the rest of Texans showing up. We ended up having 4.2 million Republicans showing up, and so that 0.2 was the differential in the election. Now, on election night, something I said then, and I believe, is it's my job to represent every Texan, all 28 million. Whether you voted for me or not, it's my job to represent you. Now, that doesn't mean that I can agree with every Texan on every issue at every time. That's impossible. At the end of the day, on a vote, you got to vote yes or no. And there are going to be Texans that disagree with you whatever way you vote. The right way, I think, to approach politics is with an honest and candid conversation with the voters, laying out the principles that you believe so that voters know what to expect. And so, look, one of the things I was happy about, if you look at the race between me and Beto O'Rourke, it didn't get nasty and personal and have character attacks. It didn't go into the gutter. He didn't go into the gutter, and I didn't go into the gutter. We had a real and substantive disagreement on what policies are best for Texas and best for the country. And I told the people of Texas, I said, my number one priority is jobs, 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 jobs. And so I'm going to fight for lower taxes, less regulations, because that helps small businesses expand, that creates more jobs and more opportunity. Now, there's some Texans who may disagree with that, and that's why we have elections, to have a choice. But I will fight for jobs for every Texan, but not only that, for constitutional rights for every Texan. And that's one of the great blessings. In the policy and political world, I've had two great loves in my life. The American free enterprise system, which I think has been the greatest engine for prosperity the world has ever seen. It has defeated more poverty than anything in the history of mankind. And then secondly, the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And the beauty of the Constitution and Bill of Rights is it protects everyone. Free speech, which I believe passionately in. Free speech protects your right to speak, whether you agree with me or disagree with me, and I will vigorously defend your right to speak, even if you disagree with me. Religious liberty, the beauty of it is whatever your faith or no faith at all. Religious liberty is all about protecting your right to make choices about faith and conscience and what you believe and how you will live. And so that's how I try to approach the job, is to fight for jobs for every Texan and fight for the constitutional rights of every Texan. And that's what I intend to continue doing.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, Senator, your staff has told me that I'm personally responsible if you miss that vote, and that I will have to explain to the people of Texas why you didn't cast that vote. It's a big state. I don't have the ability.
So proving, Larry, that I'm very bad at following instructions, I'll take one more question.
Hey, I'd like to say this first. I'm Puerto Rican, actually. So you're Cuban American, I understand. And out of curiosity, were you born in America or outside?
So I was born actually in Canada, in Calgary.
Okay, so
my dad is Cuban. My mom is Irish and Italian.
I'm Puerto Rican, Dominican to be exact. My dad went from Dominican Republic to Puerto Rico about 2 to 3 years, which...
Did you say your dad's from Jamaica?
Dominican Republic.
Dominican Republic.
And as you understand, Puerto Ricans are American citizens.
Yeah.
So and there's been a lot of recent developments within the past couple of days, especially considering shooting tear gas at people across the border, which is something that is close to home for me, given that these people are people who speak Spanish and people con color café. So just, Don Cruz, out of curiosity, where and why do you stand? Where and why do you stand on such issues?
Sure. Well, thank you for your question. And let me say, is your family in Puerto Rico now?
No, I have family in Puerto Rico and some family over here.
How did they do during the hurricane?
3-4+ months without power.
Oof. So that is power restored now?
It was restored after we sent like $1,000 generators over to them, and I think that's only a small portion of it.
Wow. Look, it was a devastating hurricane. Same time Texas had Hurricane Harvey, so we went through this together and saw a lot of suffering. Listen, your question on immigration. Immigration is one of the issues on which there is deep and sometimes nasty and passionate disagreement between the sides. And a lot of the rhetoric, I think a lot of the rhetoric on both sides is overheated. I think immigration is an area where we need to take our rhetoric and calm it down a little bit. I have often described my views on immigration as being summed up in 4 words: legal, good, illegal, bad, which I think the vast majority of Texans, the vast majority of Americans agree with. Listen, my father came in 1957 from Cuba. He had nothing. He'd been imprisoned and tortured in Cuba. My father fought in the Cuban Revolution, and he fled and came to America, came to Texas seeking freedom. I mean, when he arrived in Texas, he was 18, and he couldn't speak English. He had $100 in his underwear, and he washed dishes making 50 cents an hour. And so Texas in America, for my family, has been a haven for freedom, just as it has been for millions of families for centuries. That's who we are. We are a nation built by immigrants, but there's a right way to come. And I think most Texans, most Americans at the same time want to see the border secure. Look, I live in Texas. We've got 1,200 miles of border in the state of Texas. I've spent a lot of time down on the border. It doesn't make any sense that we don't know who's coming into this country, that we have people being trafficked in by drug cartels and human traffickers. Many of the people being trafficked in by those cartels are being physically abused, being sexually abused. I don't think it's compassionate to see human beings be put in the custody of human traffickers who do horrible things. The way our immigration system is meant to operate is there's a right way to come. You come legally, you follow the rules, and you come seeking the American dream. And we should be able to reach common ground on that. Unfortunately, this issue right now is politically deeply, deeply divided. I think there's a lot of common sense solutions in terms of actually securing the border, stopping the illegal trafficking across it. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that you demonize those who are coming. Look, many times the people coming are the victims of this broken system and are facing abuse at the hands of the cartels and criminals. But the right way to come is have a legal system where people can come and seek a better life in America. And that's what I'd like to see. I celebrate every day that we are a nation of immigrants, but we're also a nation of rule of law. And we can do both. We can respect the rule of law and welcome and celebrate those coming to live the American dream. We can do both, and I think we need to do both. And with that, I am going to miss the Senate vote if I don't go, so let me just say thank you and God bless you.
Okay, where are my UVA people? So that I see where you are. There's one. Who else is out there? Okay, you're not boldly. So there's several of you. There's several back there. Good. I just wanted to see who has a chance at a B. But in any event, thank you all for treating Senator Cruz well and for laughing at his jokes, because believe me, as a speaker, it means a lot when somebody laughs or doesn't laugh at your jokes. We have a crackerjack final panel. It's almost as though you're watching in person, Washington Week in Review. So get ready. And let me ask Associate Director Ken Stroop of the Center for Politics to introduce this panel.
Again, thank you all for your patience and for your attention, and we'll try to get to more of your questions in this second panel, and it really is an all-star panel. I also want to thank the hundreds of people who continue to join us online. We're grateful and we're aware that you're there, and keep sending in your comments. The second panel will be moderated by a real all-star, Robert Costa. He is a national political reporter at the Washington Post. He joined the Post in 2014 and covers the White House, Congress, and campaigns. He is also the moderator of Washington Week on PBS and a political analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He holds a bachelor's degree in American Studies from the University of Notre Dame and a master's degree from the University of Cambridge. And I would also note that on our @Center for Politics Twitter page, we have tweeted all of the Twitter handles for all of the guests on the second panel, so you'll be able to follow them. So please welcome the moderator for the second panel, Robert Costa.
Here.
Hello.
We're still waiting on Jonathan Martin, but round of applause for J. Mart. Hey, good to see you.
Hey, Bob. Hi, pal.
Good. Take your time. So thanks so much for coming out for our panel. We're going to get started. I'm Bob Costa with the Washington Post. We're joined by Jonathan Martin, who is a national political reporter and correspondent for the New York Times. And he covers the midterms very heavily, and he's also looking ahead to the 2020 presidential race. Juleanna Glover, the founder and CEO of Ridgely Walsh, a public affairs consultancy, a longtime Republican advisor to presidents and major Republican officials.
But not a Republican anymore.
But not a Republican anymore. We'll get into that during our discussion here today. Chris LaCivita, a political operative. He was a senior advisor to Senator Rand Paul's 2016 presidential campaign. Chris is also a real veteran of Senate campaigns like the one in 2014 for Pat Roberts in Kansas, and he's a veteran of Virginia politics. Cliff Young is president of Ipsos Public Affairs here in the United States. He also works a lot in national and global affairs, doing polling around the world, studying economic issues, international policy, and how different voters are interacting with those different fronts. And then, of course, Donna Brazile, a veteran Democratic political strategist, a friend of everyone here. She's an author, syndicated columnist, former chair of the Democratic National Committee, and someone who was also campaign manager for Al Gore in 2000. So let's give a warm welcome to our panel here today. Since we only have so much time, we're going to get right into the discussion. I'd ask our panelists to be relatively brief with your answers. We want to make sure that we have a time to get to a lot of topics today. So we'll start with Jonathan. You've been covering the midterms, and you think about the rural and exurban and suburban divide that we've seen in this emerging political map. What should we expect in 2020 based on what you saw this year?
I think these trends are only going to continue. I see no reason why there would be any reversal of kind of this pulling apart. It was striking looking at the maps after Election Day. It almost, in some ways, like defies the candidate, the campaigns, fundraising, incumbency, the nature, all the kind of traditional things that we look towards to explain the results of an election seem to increasingly matter less than the identity of the state or district and their demographics. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes the kind of red places are getting redder, the blue places are getting bluer, and a lot of the purple is getting more blue. And I think that's why Democrats won 40 seats in the House. But you just take your two states that we talk a lot about, Michigan and Ohio. And the incumbent senators there won, but they were leading in their polls by double digits, and they won by, roughly 5 or 6 points apiece. And if you look at why that is, well, they won because of massive margins in the cities and suburbs, but even though they were running against little-known challengers, their numbers came down in most of the rural areas in those states from what they had previously posted. I mean, there was a time 10 years ago, not very long ago, where Senate incumbents would win by 30, 40 points in some races. It seems now like a lot of these seats, even where there's a sort of little-known incumbent, they automatically get 40% of the vote. It's really striking to watch, and the reason for that is, to answer your question, is because of this pulling apart of the country's political demography. One last thing, and I'll shut up. There are only 3 House districts left in the country with Republicans that Hillary Clinton carried in 2016. There were 23 at the start of the cycle. Tells you a lot.
And thank you. And can everyone make sure they speak into their microphone so everyone here can hear? Donna, listening to Jonathan's remarks, when you look as a Democrat at that map and you think about the presidential race that's about to begin, people heading to Iowa and New Hampshire, who's the best kind of candidate that could seize these different dynamics and really help the party win back the White House? Or what should the party be looking for as they evaluate that field?
First of all, thank you so much for allowing me to be here today. And it's always good to be on GW's campus. Greetings from Georgetown, where I've been for 17 years as an adjunct professor. I want to first say that the gender gap is real, and it's driving a lot of the enthusiasm that you're seeing within the Democratic Party. And as a result of that, I think the Democrats are going to be looking for an outsider. Traditionally, women are not seen as insiders. And while we have several well-known female candidates who will likely toss their gloves into the ring in 2020, I still believe that an outsider has a better chance of winning the nomination in 2020 versus one of our insiders that we now have in Washington, D.C. And the reason why is because the grassroots, they want a fighter. They want somebody who can tackle some of the big issues like climate change, gun violence. They don't want to listen to a Democrat with what I call Washington, D.C.-based talking points, where there's a comma in between the sentence and a question mark at the end. So I think what you're going to see in 2020 is a renewed attempt for an outsider to try to come in and to save the day for the Democratic Party. The one last thing, and this is attributed again to the grassroots. What we saw in 2017 and 2018, we saw basically a new generation of candidates who are emerging within the Democratic Party. They're not seeking permission. They're not going to the usual suspect, the PAC, the super donors or the super elite within the party. They're being fueled and empowered by the grassroots. These $5 donations, and by the way, I love $5 donations. That keeps my wallet full because I can get 5 here, 5 there, 10 there, okay? But these $5 donations and the fact that you have millennials engaged, it's going to transform the Democratic Party in 2020. Last point, I know you told me to keep it close, but I'm Catholic. I can't help myself. 2020 is going to be an awesome year because in addition to competing in the traditional 18 states in the District of Columbia that gets us to 246 electoral votes, Democrats, we now have a new terrain in order to play. Yes, we got to continue to battle in Ohio, continue to battle for the 29 electoral votes in Florida, but Arizona, 11 electoral votes. Arizona, Georgia, these states that Democrats have never stepped in a presidential year, at least in the last 20 years, guess what? You'll see a lot of Democrats. Get ready, hot dogs and hamburgers, we're coming.
Donna, real quickly, 2 or 3 names, who are 2 or 3 outsiders we should keep an eye on?
Well, you know, as a former chair of the party and a member of the DNC, an at-large member, I should keep my mouth shut.
A couple names. You can't tease us, Donna, with outsiders and then not name a couple.
Well, you know, look, there's no question that we have people, we have Mayor Eric Garcetti, we have Beto O'Rourke. I know he's a member of Congress. He's a, you know, he lost to Ted Cruz, but there's a Beto factor out there. There's a lot of energy for Tom Steyer, who people believe is energizing and registering new voters, especially millennials. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people that I probably know in my head, but I can't mention now because I'm still talking to a lot of people, we're going to see a lot of people. We're going to have 4 rounds of a debate. So people like Jonathan and Bob will have to really work hard because we have a seniors table, and I'm not just referring to age. We will have an adult, and that's a good table, okay? And then we have the children's table. They're new to politics. We got a mayor in South Bend, Indiana, who's going to run. And I'm excited to see Pete Buttigieg run for president. And then we're going to have the pre-K table. All right? So we got 4 rounds. It's going to be an exciting year to be a Democrat. Get ready for us. Hot dogs, hamburgers, and if you're from Louisiana, a little etouffee and gumbo. We're ready for you.
Thank you, Donna.
Isn't there a mayor of New Orleans, too, who may run?
Mitch Landrieu.
Mitch is still hemming and hawing, but I'm going home for the holidays, so maybe I can twist his arm. After all, we need a little boudin in the race, too.
All right. Juleanna, when you think about the Republican Party, a lot of excitement on the Democratic side, but you've left the Republican Party. You know a lot of the top GOP leaders in the country. With all the news today on Michael Cohen and the Mueller investigation, are Trump critics like yourself thinking about maybe starting a third party, maybe supporting a challenger to President Trump in the 2020 primary, like a Senator Ben Sasse in Nebraska, Ohio Governor John Kasich, maybe even Utah Senator-elect Mitt Romney?
So lots of talk about millennials.
Talk in the mic.
You know, Donna, you mentioned, so let me pull this mic a little bit forward or let me move forward. 81% of millennials believe there should be a third party. About 42% of the electorate, maybe 39% right now identify as independents. 54% of Democrats believe that there should be a third party. Right now, we're dealing with a dichotomy that seems to be off-putting to everybody, but except for if you identify either on the hard left or the hard right. Republican Party seems to be shrinking. Democratic Party seems to be growing.
Juliana, just
Republican Party seems to be shrinking. The Democratic Party seems to be growing a little bit, but not significantly. What no one's talking about, and I think is vastly misrepresented or unrepresented in the political dynamic, is the interests of people who are in the middle. I'll ask you all. So let's say, who wants to bet on the Democrats coming up with a nominee in 2020 that will win against Trump or the Trump apologist? That seems. Let me ask you this one. Who, if you had a choice coming up in the 2020 election between, say, Trump-Pence, let's do the next most famous Democrat, Bernie Sanders, and somebody like a Kamala, and maybe up the middle bipartisan ticket of something like a Biden-Romney. What would you all pick? Biden-Romney? Trump-Pence? Or the Democrats? Bernie?
I will go in that direction and now. Oh, neither.
We're in Washington. We're in D.C.
Well, it's no, I know. So, but earlier this year I wrote a piece arguing that the Republicans should indeed support a third party. I ran in the New York Times. It kind of broke my inbox. Many people who I esteem and lots of people with a lot of resources reached out and said, how do we do this? I think that it's something that we should all consider. I think it's something that if we found the right candidate, the money and the expertise would come to it pretty quickly. So,
but isn't the Republican Party, Juliana, in the grip of President Trump?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I assume the red states are going to stay with Trump or whoever follows in Trump's footsteps if he does indeed survive this.
Cliff, when you think about the international scene, we hear the term nationalism from President Trump, but we also see it across the world, across Western Europe. So often we think about politics in red versus blue dynamics, in Republican versus Democrat. What about nationalism as a new theme that's changing our politics as we look to 2020?
Well, I'm the data dude, so I have my stack of data right here, but I won't look at it for now. I just want to say I absolutely agree with Donna. That's my opening statement. Absolutely. I think we're in the age of the outsider. And I would even make the argument that we probably shouldn't overemphasize the word nationalism. I'll come back to that. What we have to understand, both in the United States and globally, especially in the West, is that there's a rise of anti-establishmentism, I think I just invented that word, of outsider the candidates that are willing to shake the system. Indeed, if you look at polling, whether it be in the United States or Europe or Latin America, the West principally, there is supermajority belief that the system is broken, that the establishment is not delivering on the basic promises, that traditional parties and politicians no longer care about the average person like me, for instance. And linked to that is a belief that to take the country back, to take society back, well, that sounds very familiar, right? By the way, it's not just happening in the U.S. That's not the rhetoric just in the U.S. To take the country back, we need a strong leader who might need to break the rules to take the country back. This is a phenomenon we're seeing everywhere. Obviously, it takes on different flavors in different places. Here in the United States, we had a right-leaning populist that came to power on that message and that outsider message. But let me just kind of present this to you specifically, because many of us were perplexed, obviously, especially in 2015, about Trump. But I think Bernie Sanders was interesting as well. And indeed, if you really think about it, they're two sides of the same coin. Indeed, they were both outsider candidates. They operationalized the disgust and anger in different ways. The left typically has much more economic equality argument. And the right, it's much more cultural in nature, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. The point being is these trends, these sort of attitudes and belief have created an operating environment that isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So I would expect that the candidate on the left, in this case, the United States, the Democrats, the candidate that's has more of an outsider profile, maybe an insider-outsider, a little bit more vanilla, not as sort of problematic and spicy. I use the example of France, of Macron and Le Pen. They're both outsider candidates, by the way. One was a little bit more vanilla. The other one was, it really hurt and burned when you actually swallowed a little bit of it. But the point being is, in both cases, they were outsider candidates. And I would expect the most likely candidate to have a chance on the left, that is with Democrats, will have some sort of outsider profile.
Chris, you've worked a lot with Senate campaigns and the Republican Party. As you look to the U.S. Senate being a real galvanizing force for Republican voters this year with the Supreme Court and the federal court, are we going to see that again in 2020, or are there too many distractions with the new Congress, investigations on President Trump, House Democrats maybe trying to cut deals with the president on infrastructure, or does the U.S. Senate remain that same big factor for 2020?
Well, first of all, I think it should be obviously we picked up, there was, Republicans actually had a net gain in seats in the United States Senate. And obviously the whole issue of the Supreme Court played into that. I mean, if you look at what happened in Indiana, North Dakota, obviously their votes against Kavanaugh had an impact overall. But, next cycle going into 2020, the Senate seats, so, we have 34 seats that are up for election, 22 are held by the GOP, 12 are held by the Dems. And I guess you could say and I look at it just looking at it from a tactical standpoint, what are those races really that are going to be in play? Potentially North Carolina, Tom Tillis, that's an R+5 district, state. Arizona is going to be open, probably a very good opportunity for Democrats to pick up, which would have obviously an impact in the presidential race. Joni Ernst in Iowa is another race that Republicans will have to play defense on, and as well Susan Collins and Gardner, Cory Gardner in Colorado. But at the same time, we have an opportunity to pick up a seat in Alabama in a presidential race. So, look, from the standpoint of looking at the House map and looking at the Senate map, you've got to be able to actually accomplish something. And there are some key issues that the president has made clear that he wants to get done. One of the first things right after he was elected said he wants to repeal and replace Obamacare. What ends up happening? The Republicans were in a prime position to do that, and they didn't. And I think that to a certain extent they paid a price for that in the ballot box in some districts. And I think that the continued stymieing on the wall, you go debate the merits of it, but at the end of the day, that's going to have an impact on Republican enthusiasm. And so we've got to be able to accomplish certain things. I think the infrastructure bill is going to be very important because that's so local, right? I mean, and so these things are all going to come into play. But but at the same time, listening to what everyone was saying about the slew of candidates are going to be running in 2020 on the Democrat side. Let's not forget Tom Steyer and Bloomberg's money. That's going to have an impact. We don't know how much of an impact or in what way. I don't think the Democrats really know. I don't think we can really say who is the Democrat base going to go for. I would agree that they're going to follow the Republicans' lead and go with an outsider. But you know, the money factor is obviously going to play, and then the fact that you all changed the rules to a certain extent with superdelegates and the role that they play, that's going to shift and change the party process. So you know, it's going to be a fascinating year. That's for certain.
We've mentioned a lot of outsiders.
Yeah.
Jonathan, you spent a lot of time reporting on the insiders during the shadow campaign, the front runners in many polls, Vice President Biden, Senator Warren. Where do they fit in this mix?
It's not clear. I'm curious what Donna thinks about this. I believe that this is the most wide open Democratic and uncertain Democratic primary since at least 2004 and maybe since '92. Where going in, there's no obvious front runner, where a pair of the most formidable candidates may not even run, i.e. Sanders and Biden, and still up in the air what's going to happen. So I think there's great uncertainty about the contours of the race. I do, though, think that you know, Washington credentials and experience will have about as much appeal as they did in 2016 for the Republicans. And that's a sort of trend that's bigger than both parties. This is not a terribly original insight, but we have basically at least 4 parties jammed into the architecture of 2 parties. And it just, it shows. We're not Europe. We have a 2-party system, and it is increasingly ungainly. You've got a Bernie Sanders sort of leftist party. You've got a more Clinton, Obama-style center-left party. You've got a kind of Bushian establishment center-right party. And you've got a more Trump nationalist party. But they're all sort of jammed into 2 parties. And I think that creates some real tensions. You saw that with the Republicans in 2016. Certainly, and I think you're going to see it now more with the Democrats, where their coalition includes everything from, you know, true blue socialist to kind of country club suburbanites who are basically Republicans on fiscal issues, but think that Trump is utterly repellent in terms of his conduct, and so they've left the party. That's a pretty big coalition, from socialists to the kind of, you know, Chevy Chase, Greenwich crowd. To absorb. And so how does that play out in a primary? I think it's going to be fascinating to sort of watch unfold. And I will borrow a great Dr. Larry J. Sabato dictum, which is he who lives by the crystal ball winds up eating glass. So I will not gaze into the crystal ball about the 2020 Democratic primary, except to say that uncertainty is certainly the order of the day. And I do think that they will tend towards more of an outsider.
But you still should read Larry's Crystal Ball newsletter. It's terrific. Don't worry, you're not going to eat glass. Donna, are we looking at a contested convention for the Democrats if we have these 4 tables from the seniors to the pre-K?
Well,
and will the party be able to handle that with the rules? We saw what happened in 2016.
First of all, I think the party can handle it at the end of the day, but unfortunately, many of us are going to be in a position where, let's just say, we might not want to show up for work. We have, as you all know, the 4 early states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada. They will likely be scheduled in the month of February. And then in March, we have this huge crowded field of states positioning themselves to become, of course, the arbiter of the primary. California moving up to March is going to create a massive traffic jam for obvious reasons. We have it likely maybe 2, perhaps 3 candidates who will hail from California. And if they sort of, I guess, split the vote, we might not know the outcome for California for at least 2 or 3 weeks because of the way they count votes in California. It takes a long time. They should go down to Louisiana. We'll count them overnight, and before you vote, we'll know the results. That being said, with Super Duper Tuesday perhaps being a huge event, we won't know. Yeah. 4 or 5 candidates will emerge, during the month of March, and then we'll go into April with big states like Pennsylvania, New York, And again, with proportional rules, that will bring us into May with a smaller but significant number of states, and then June, where you have 3 or 4 states, and here come our convention. So we might get to the convention, and the superdelegates, the people who are now outside the box, the superdelegates will have to come back into the box and ultimately decide who the nominee is. I do not like to be placed in that position. I wanted and I argued that the superdelegates are the automatic delegates. I'm an automatic delegate, and please do not tell me I am not relevant. I am very relevant. But as an automatic delegate, I would like to be part of the sauce and not wait until the voters decide, and then I got to go in and perhaps make the decision that the voters don't want. So we're looking at a wide open contest. I think you're right. I think it's more like 92 than 04, because by 04, we understood that it was about the war and about the economy. And, you know, Barack Obama emerged after the convention in 04 to be...
No, it was 08.
No, he emerged after 04 in the convention.
Yes, right.
It was Kerry, because we were still dealing with the immediate impact of 9/11 and there was this entrenched feeling that it could happen again. And we assume that women voters and others, those who tend to wait until the last moment to make up their minds, we assume that they wanted someone with Kerry's background and John Kerry's status. And by the way, John Kerry is now thinking about it.
I saw that.
I'm telling you, we need to have a drinking contest on the Democratic side.
Back to the future.
Back to the future. But like I said, we have a seniors table, so there's a role for John Kerry. Everybody.
I've got an Oppo packet on John Kerry if anybody wants to see it.
Okay, baby. No more Swift boat, and I'm sitting next to you.
For those close consumers of politics out there, they'll appreciate it.
Yeah. But be careful who you're sitting by, because you couldn't Swift boat me, because I understand what's in the water. So yeah, at the end of the day, to your question, we're going to have a long, drawn-out process.
Thank you.
And I do believe that at the end of the day, we might go to the committee. It won't be contested. We'll probably know there will be a front runner, somebody with perhaps 30 more delegates. Ultimately, we may wait until we get to the convention. And by the way, I don't even know what a convention is going to be, because there's 3 cities that are still competing, Milwaukee, Miami, and Houston. And yes, I have a preference. But we'll see what happens.
What's your preference?
Houston.
Houston.
Yeah.
Close to home.
It's 5 hours from New Orleans.
Fair enough.
Should be in New Orleans.
Juleanna, when you think about your career, you've worked for some of the leading foreign policy Republican hawks of our time, Senator McCain, President Bush, Vice President Cheney. Where does foreign policy fit as we look at the political road ahead? President Trump has not really been an interventionist, but he's caused some Republicans to be alarmed by his handling of North Korea. Others have cheered him in issues like Syria.
I think most foreign policy right now is focused on what's going on with Russia, particularly today. In terms of sort of where Trump has led on foreign policy, it's been sort of visceral, reactive, definitely something where he feels like he can make the best deal at any point in time than any other human that may or may not ever existed. Corker, has tried to moderate from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and sort of offer some voices and criticism around Trump, but, Trump owns the mic on foreign policy. I don't really see any room for anybody to necessarily challenge him on that. And even in terms of he did have a Republican challenger in the primary process, I guess maybe only Kasich would be someone who would do that, and he's not someone who's particularly well credentialed in foreign policy. So,
Cliff, any thoughts on, as you look at the polling at your firm, about where we see voters going, especially in the suburban areas Jonathan was talking about?
Well, definitely. Like, first and foremost, I know we had the first panel, we talked about the midterms. And I know Kyle brought up the point about the relationship between midterms and general elections. I have a data point right here, but you won't see it, but I promise you it's here. That if you take all the elections since 1948 and you plot the midterms against the generals, there's no correlation. So it's not predictive. That doesn't mean it's not suggestive, but it's not necessarily predictive. Yes, indeed, I would say, and I'll come back and talk a bit about Trump, where he stands in a historical sense in terms of averages. By the way, I love averages. That might have been the most important human invention ever. It orients us. It gives us a reference point. But I think, obviously suburbia is a problem. I think the midterms showed that. That's the kink in his armor that makes it difficult, the math more difficult. Obviously, he won by a razor-thin margin in a few states. And I think that's a glimmer of hope for Democrats on the one hand, and storm clouds on the horizon. I don't know how many, but there's storm clouds on the horizon for the Republicans. But just stepping back a bit, we handicap elections. I handicap elections all the world for private sector clients. We have this massive database. Once again, I'm the data dude. And what do we know? Like, what are some things we know? Well, we know that incumbents have a threefold advantage over non-incumbents. Incumbency, I wouldn't say necessarily is king or queen, but incumbency is super important. The other thing is, independent of that, the most important predictor of electoral outcomes are approval ratings, right? And when you combine approval ratings with incumbency, it's an interesting mix. So what do we know? If Trump is like the average, and we can debate that, whether he's above the average, below the average, or not, what we do know, sitting president between 38 and 40 points has better than a 50-50 chance of winning the election. He's at 42, 43. You take the Gallup. I think the Gallup's a little bit of an outlier at 38. But he's still in the range where he has a significant non-zero chance of winning. He has a good chance, not necessarily an absolute chance. And so we can't discount them. Indeed, obviously the midterms creates a degree of delusion. As I was saying that apples are apples and bananas are bananas, and midterms aren't necessarily predictive of elections. They might be suggestive. But if he were just an average performer, he's in a pretty good place, if not dominant place, going into 2020. The question is, should we discount him a bit? And I think probably that could be a dynamic of this debate here, this discussion here. Is he an average performer, below average performer? There's a lot of arguments for and against, probably more against than for, but I'll leave it at that.
Chris, when you think about Virginia, you've worked for Ken Cuccinelli, you've worked for George Allen, you've been on so many campaigns in Virginia, and Virginia has at times been seen as a swing state, but they've really had to deal with the issue of race in recent years. Corey Stewart running for U.S. Senate against Democrat Tim Kaine dealt with that issue in the Confederate statues, the tragedy in Charlottesville in 2017. How do Republicans in Virginia and Republicans nationally confront the issue of race moving forward?
Well, I think just Corey Stewart, just an aberration in the Commonwealth. Matter of fact, it was strange. I actually had write-in votes for the U.S. Senate in my home county. I don't know how that happened, but the registrar called me and let me know. I was like, oh, that's nice. It's, obviously it's a very important issue that what happened in Charlottesville, obviously, inflaming, I think the positions that, what made that, I guess we were smack dab in the middle of a gubernatorial primary, Republican primary, and we had a candidate who at the time was desperate looking for attention, running against the establishment pick, right, which was Ed Gillespie. Basically latching on to any type of controversy that could feed him name ID because he didn't have money to run, so he latched onto that and used it, and he had a lot of assistance from obviously from the press corps that would follow up on anything that he said. So, I really think that's much more of an aberration. In terms of Virginia, obviously has become very much a swing state. I've done so many races in the Commonwealth. There are parts of the Commonwealth that I don't recognize from back in the early 90s. When to win a race in Virginia, it used to be minimize your losses in Northern Virginia, rack up margins in the Richmond suburbs and the Valley, Southwest and South Side, and break even in Virginia Beach. Well, that formula doesn't work anymore. And obviously, in 2008, with President Obama on the ticket, really changed, I think, quite a bit. You had a census plus African-American turnout, which means that for the Republican to win, he needed to get somewhere in the neighborhood of 64, 63% of the decided white vote. That's a very difficult formula to receive. So, and in past elections, guys like George Allen, he used to get 20, 22% of the African-American vote. But obviously that's changed as things have become a lot more polarized, unfortunately. But look, Republicans have to be very strong and very, very forceful and very quick in condemning any type of activity that could be construed, you know, as intolerant. I mean, they just need to be. But again, at the end of the day, but at the same time, I think we, from both sides, need to look at it as, because both sides do things to inflame divisions in order to maximize base turnout. I mean, I remember in 2004, or actually in 2000, I was managing George Allen's U.S. Senate race against Chuck Robb in the Commonwealth of Virginia when a mailer showed up from I can't remember who, somebody that had, you know, chains on the back of a pickup truck and was basically saying that George Bush was for dragging an African-American guy through the streets of Texas. So, and that was pretty inflamed and pretty nasty. So, you know, hopefully at some point in time people get away from those types of inflamed, that kind of inflamed rhetoric and tactic. But at the end of the day, you know, I think Corey Stewart will probably move back to Minnesota, which would be nice. Republicans can focus on the future, at least in the Commonwealth.
Juleanna, any thoughts on either race, or you look at the House GOP right now, a scarcity of women in the U.S. House? I know you're not a Republican anymore, but you know the party.
Do know the party very, very well.
So what do you make of the Republican challenges both on gender and race?
I mean, I think we reap what we sow. I mean, the Republican Party has not been particularly good in the last couple of years in standing up when they've seen any type of racial discrimination issues. And of course, you know, Trump's activity around the, you know, the pro-life movement has decreased support among women in the suburbs. So, you know, it's not really a lot to observe there other than the facts as they exist. And he's not done much to make himself appealing, I mean, to either minorities or to women in the suburbs in particular.
Cliff, I want to use you to bounce into a question for Jonathan and Donna. When you look at the Democratic Party, there's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, newly elected representative from New York, defines herself as a Democratic socialist. So does Senator Sanders from Vermont. When you're talking to Democratic voters in your surveys, how do they describe themselves? Is this Democratic socialism on the rise on the left and within the Democratic Party?
Yeah, the first sort of response is, I don't know. I actually don't know. That's a great question. What we do know is the sort of, and I'd step back from labels, the rhetoric that she uses, the belief system that she emphasizes resonates with her base. Right, and I completely agree with the comment here that we have 4 different parties, one of which is a far left-leaning, kind of socially oriented, economic equality, economic justice, social justice oriented party, and that's sort of the rhetoric that she uses. If you were just to pinch what she says, maybe not the label specifically, but the sort of rhetoric that she uses, without a doubt resonates with that sort of base. The size of it, nationally speaking, maybe 15 to 20% or so. It's not insignificant. By the way, on the other side, we're talking probably about 15% of the population are strong nativists. If you look at, if I were to project long term, I mean, we obviously have a population that's changing demographically, and it's significantly so. Indeed, that is one of the trends, going from a primary majority white country to one that isn't. That's one of the key trends that's driving and creating our new world. And her sort of diversity-oriented rhetoric is increasingly going to resonate with a larger portion of the population. Indeed, if you look specifically, kind of looking forward in terms of generational replacement, millennials have much more of that sort of rhetoric, that sort of orientation toward that sort of rhetoric than older generations. And Don and I were talking before in the green room. I always use the term kind of to explain it. It's from my grandmother, who was an activist, and she always said, there's nothing that a good Christian burial can't resolve. And so you have old people dying and leaving the population, new ones coming in with different sort of value sets. Indeed, that sort of rhetoric, that belief system that encompasses that, a democratic socialist, is on the rise, but it's the slow march of history.
Jonathan, when you look at the 2020 Democratic field, if that democratic socialism energy is there, where does someone like Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio fit? He was able to win in a state in 2018 that Republicans were able to win the gubernatorial race. President Trump's voters still came out in that state, but he found a way, maybe running on trade, to survive. Are the Democrats recognizing the tension between the Sherrod Browns of the party and the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes?
I mean, the question to me is, will 2020 be more like the 2016 Democratic primary or the 2008 Democratic primary? And what I mean by that is, will it be a kind of ideological litmus test, or will it be a more complex question of generation and persona and charisma and inspiration? I mean, people forget this, but Barack Obama was not the most liberal candidate in the Democratic field in 2008. John Edwards ran to the left. Don't forget John Edwards, folks, who coined that great phrase, the two Americas. Hillary Clinton, in many ways, was more of a progressive than Obama, certainly on health care. In fact, he attacked her for having a mandate in her health care plan. So it's not clear to me what this is going to be, and Democratic primaries aren't always, the center-left versus the left. And I'm not convinced that it's going to be this time either. And you just, look no further than Beto O'Rourke, who, while certainly staked out progressive stances in Texas, was not somebody who kind of ran an ideological campaign. He ran more of an Obama-style campaign that's more about uplift and unity and a sort of better kind of politics than it was about, here's my white paper on these 5 issues. So I think we just don't know if this is an 08 primary or more of a 16 primary. But even in 16, I would posit that, well, certainly Bernie was able to sort of galvanize a lot of folks on the left because of his ideological stances. It wasn't just that. I mean, a lot of the Bernie support was more of an anti-Hillary sort of rallying effect because they wanted to turn the page on the Clintons. Yes, ideologically in some ways, but not just ideologically.
A final thing to Donna, and then we'll take a few questions from the audience. Donna, when Jonathan mentioned Congressman O'Rourke from Texas, his Senate campaign, you look at Stacey Abrams running in Georgia, Andrew Gillum in Florida, disappointments for the Democrats, but they came close. Beto O'Rourke, a disappointment, came close. What's it going to take for the Democrats? They just lost in Mississippi this week, but again came close with Mike Espy, to win in the South, your home, or to come back in a place like Texas and Georgia or Florida and go over the edge?
It's funny. You were reading my notes because I put Gillum's Abrams. It's coming. Geography, demography, the energy, the millennials, the numbers are there. What Stacey and Andrew did was to expand the electorate, to empower a new generation to take their seats at the table. It's amazing that while they lost, we were able to still pick up seats. Lucy Macbeth is now representing Georgia 6. That's a huge achievement. And she ran on, healthcare and gun violence, dealing with those 2 issues. And Florida, Andrew lost, but still we were able to pick up Florida 26, Florida 27. We picked up seats. And if you look at the state legislative seats where we've been losing over the last 8 years, Democrats flipped eight seats and took away 2 Republican supermajority. Once again, the future of the Democratic Party lies with not only embracing millennials and some of the issues that they care about, but also allowing this new generation of candidates to take their seats at the table. If we're able to harvest this energy and to turn this electoral energy into advancing the Democratic agenda, we will succeed. Last thing, when I was a kid growing up in the South, we always thought that, well, with a good black vote, all we needed was perhaps 35 to 40% of the white vote. We didn't have to get more than 35, 40% of the white vote. Well, today with a good black vote, we only need 30% of the white vote. And we've seen evidence of that in Virginia, where Justin Fairfax won. And of course, we've seen evidence in other places in the South, but honestly, we've seen that evidence with Republicans.
Right.
And
with Doug Wilder.
With Doug Wilder. But so my point is that if we're ever going to achieve parity for women, because women are still underrepresented in politics, although we've made significant advances in this last cycle, we need both Republicans as well as Democrats running. We need Republicans to pick up the baton and encourage women to get in the pipeline, because you cannot do it with Democrats alone. And the same is true with African Americans and other minorities. We need both parties to engage these communities in order to empower them to seek public office. That's the only way we're going to have true representation of the great diversity of our country, which is a strength. It's a strength to have the diversity of our country represented at the table.
Before we get to questions, if people could line up, that'd be great. I just want to thank Larry Sabato, who's been a friend and a wonderful politics.
Thank you, Larry.
He and his team at the Center of Politics are a class operation, and I really appreciate as a reporter all the work they do to provide nonpartisan analysis, the whole UVA team, and really thank you to GW for hosting this 20th Annual American Democracy Conference.
The undefeated UVA Cavaliers.
That's right.
Yes.
By the way.
Now, to the audience members,
Which team?
please limit your question to one sentence and make it a question. I'm serious. I've watched the rest of this conference. With all respect, respect the audience's time and the panel's time. Ask a one-sentence question and then step away. Thank you.
Swift boats.
All right. My question in the backdrop of third-party yearning, second choice balloting, Yankee aberration or wave of the future?
Ranked choice, you mean?
Juleanna, you want to take it?
I mean, I think ranked choice is an incredibly intriguing proposition. I think in Virginia, and Chris, I'd be curious what you thought about this, because obviously Virginia ended up with a very weak senatorial candidate. But if there had been ranked choice voting in Virginia, there wouldn't have been a Corey Stewart candidacy.
Right.
I think that the time's right for a lot of innovations in the political space. It's been pretty stagnant for a long time. And it seems to me that there's very much an appetite to see, different types of change that could include structural changes as well as new candidates.
And the question was about ranked choice. Chris, you have any points on that?
Well, I mean, I lost the governor's race in 2013 in Virginia by 1.6 points, 1.6 percentage points, and the independent was a libertarian who received over 4.5 points. So, they have an impact. Generally, it's not one, I think, in a state like Virginia that favors the Republicans. But I mean, look, you can talk about third parties. I quite frankly am a big two-party guy, but at the same time, I think the biggest problem and the biggest threat to the two-party system in this country was McCain-Feingold, because basically it took the money out of the parties and threw it to basically anyone with money to actually impact the outcome of, be it a primary or a general election. I mean, it's a personal opinion of mine, but I ran the Senate committee, was political director in 2002 with Bill Frist when we had soft money, that awful soft money. And so, I've seen the difference in the political committees in Washington become less and less of a factor. I think the established political committees become less and less a factor. And then you have whether that be the Kochs or the Steyers of the world who actually have a direct impact in electoral politics. And then, of course, you have the advent of, 501c4s, which basically raise boatloads of money that no one knows where the donors are coming from. And, so.
Great, thank you.
Just another point.
Another brief question.
Yeah. My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. My question is, diversity is not good enough. We have to have fairness and justice. Everybody have an equal opportunity to express their capability, and government should have a responsibility to allow them to speak and campaign. Fairness is not small donor campaign, but fairness. And so maintain the website or debate for every candidate.
Donna, how do we look at that?
Not two parties.
Thank you so much. Donna, how do we look at access? You focus on voter suppression at the DNC. How are the Democrats looking at those kind of issues, access to our democracy?
Well, I think the party has been quite fair in allowing everyone to have a seat at the table, especially candidates. At least in my experience of being not only a vice chair, but the interim chair twice in the Democratic Party, is that our rules allow outsiders to come in and to run on our ticket. So I think we have allowed that. In terms of the debates for 2020, Someone else is going to have to make that decision. I'm out of the debate business. Hello. Everybody know that if I'm in the debate business, I'm going to tell you what we're going to debate, and therefore you will get a question about what we're going to debate. But I'm out of the debate business. But I do believe in 2020, we're going to have to ensure that all of the candidates get ample opportunity to be in those public forums. But I also encourage candidates, don't wait for the media and wait for the party to decide when we're going to open up the debate process. Go out there now. Go out there and meet the candidates. Go out there and be the third or fourth person in these town hall meetings that get a chance to introduce themselves. So I would encourage people to get out there early and to go to those states right now, plant seeds, and start talking to the activists. That's the way they get heard.
Also, as part of that, I would add that in terms of diversity, Republican efforts to suppress voter turnout have been one of the most outrageous and off-putting activities that I've witnessed as a participant in the political process. It's one of the reasons why I'm not a Republican anymore, is sort of this years of watching Republicans continue to try and keep people from voting.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I have a question. Considering that the punditry class didn't see the last two presidents being elected, that I want you to consider what are the possibilities of a, for example, very credible Jill Stein type candidate running and destroying, for example, progressives in the Democratic Party, or the very real possibility that Donald Trump doesn't run?
Jonathan?
I think Trump not running is possible depending upon the circumstances of his legal exposure and the exposure.
So euphemistic.
The exposure of his family and associates. And I think on the left, I agree. Look, I think in a really fractured Democratic field with proportional primaries and conventions and a campaign that could go to the convention, I wouldn't rule anything out in terms of who could be the nominee. And he raised a good point. I think the rise of President Trump does suggest that people should not believe that the most hard to believe possibility won't come true. There's a great quote from Arthur Schlesinger, said, "The future outwits all of our certitudes." And I think that we certainly saw that in the case of President Obama. And I also, just real fast, I got into a back and forth with an Obama person the other day about this, who is very fond of Beto O'Rourke. Look, I think Obama 08 and it just sort of proves that you've got to run when the moment is there. Mm-hmm. And you can't wait, and you can't sort of try and game this thing out. Chris Christie ran in 2016, probably should have run in 2012, right? Right. Senator Warren, who is probably going to run this time around, there was an opening for her that Bernie failed in 2016. And I think the lesson of all this is you can't game this stuff out. You run when the moment presents itself, because the voters increasingly aren't going to judge you on how many, do you have X years of experience. Right. They're going to judge you on the moment and the sort of ripening of the candidacy.
Yeah, just to add, just to add to this point, my initial point was, we're in this sort of age of the outsider. And maybe you would expect outsiders coming from every direction, right? But systems, institutions, orders matter for political outcomes. Public opinion's essential, obviously, but systems, institutions, orders are important. And we have to remember that Donald Trump did not run as a third-party alternative candidate, but he basically committed a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. So yes, there's always a possibility of an outsider candidate gaining steam on the outside of the system. I think that's the probabilities are very low, but it could happen. If the probabilities perhaps are higher for there to be a hostile takeover of the Democratic Party than some sort of outsider coming through sort of a third-party way.
Sir.
First of all, hold on. Too tall. Jonathan, when you mentioned an Obama official that was pro-Beto, I feel like that's Dan Pfeiffer, and you're just not mentioning it. But my question is, do you think Obama campaigning for Gillum in Florida and in a few other races, and some they lost, was a hindrance? And do you think he would be best served to be campaigning for the 2020 candidate when they come out of the primary?
I'll give you a short answer. I don't think it had much impact adverse impact on Gillum. I think that was not Gillum's challenge. I think much more complicated than who the surrogate was for like 1 day of campaigning.
Probably would have been even worse had he not shown up, because then the question would have been, why isn't he here?
Right, and he was in South Florida,
Right.
and frankly, that was one of the big problems Gillum had, was that turnout in Miami-Dade was abysmal, one of the worst in the state. So if anything, Obama probably brought out a few voters.
Midterm elections are about turning out your base,
right?
Bottom line.
Obama was very helpful to Democratic candidates across the country, and I was pleased to see not only the president, but Mrs. Obama, who did a fantastic job encouraging people to register and vote. They were an asset to the Democratic Party.
Thank you, sir. We'll take these final two.
Okay. My question is about the involvement of the news media in the midterms, especially through these stories such as the caravan situation, where we see these, I've heard them being called October surprises, where it's basically a story that is brought up right before the midterm and then it's pretty much dropped, and whether or not is actually a real threat to the country or just to society is debatable. So we saw this with we're seeing this with the caravan, where it was a really big thing on the conservative media like Fox News, and even today, like weeks after the midterm, it's still 5 weeks away. It's not, you can debate whether or not it's really a problem, but it's not relevant at this moment, and it wasn't relevant during the midterms. And then we saw this in 2014 with the Ebola crisis, where it was another excuse for conservative candidates to talk about borders and immigration and stuff like that. And then following the midterm, it was pretty much dropped, and no one's talked about it anymore. So just like, what do you think
Who would
about?
like to Cliff, on the effect of the caravan and the way that media handles these sort of
Yeah, I mean,
issues?
I'll set aside sort of the role of the media and their relative responsibility in respect to this issue, and just go back to the initial point of, understanding that across the board there's a belief that the society's broken across partisan lines, but it's operationalized differently. On the Republican side, on the right, it's operationalized much more in a visceral way. It's much less deductive, and it's extremely linked to nativism, immigration, and white grievance. Actually, those are the two key drivers. Like, I rarely look at demographics. I know it's easier to slice and dice by demographics. I look at attitudes. And what you're seeing there is a very deliberate attempt or program to create proof points to do what I call emotional pump priming. And so what you're doing is you're activating people at a cognitive level in a visceral way. We call, cognitive psychologists and behavioral economists, we call it hot cognition, or inducing biased cognitive reasoning. And in my mind, above and beyond the issue of declining trust and the belief that the system is broken, it perhaps is our biggest challenge today, because it creates problems of governance and creating consensus. But more specifically, the caravan was a deliberate attempt. It was a proof point that allowed one side to really emotionally pump prime.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is directed to Ms. Brazile. I saw you a couple of years ago back in San Francisco. I like you, and you're direct and you're to the point. However, I completely disagree with you on some subjects. Case in point, I want to speak with you in regards to, say, for example, the walkaway movement, or other movements that are leaving the Democratic Party because they feel that they are not represented anymore. And I just wanted my question to you is, how do you combat that? And say for also, when people look at you and they see that you're a person of color, they automatically think that you're going to vote Democrat. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. So my question to you is, whatever happened to the Democratic Party from JFK?
Well, thank you. And by the way, I sometimes disagree with myself.
I like the gumbo, though.
Oh, girl, I make the best gumbo. You know, the Democratic Party has evolved over the last 50 years. It has completely, I think, stripped itself of its Dixiecrat past. It is now a more central left, center-left party. It is still evolving. There's no question that for years it was seen as a a party of not only economic reforms, but social justice. And I think the 21st century Democratic Party is going to come more and more into view as a party that not only speaks on behalf of, but try to stand up for the working class, a party that believes that prosperity should be shared by all, and a party that believes in diversity and inclusion at all levels. So it is a party that has come out of the wilderness. It's been in the wilderness. You see now more Democratic governors than we had, say, a year ago, 2 years ago. You see a more diverse party with diverse candidates. We have the largest group of diverse freshmen that will serve in the House of Representatives. So it is a stronger party because of the diversity, but a stronger party because I think we're becoming very clear about our focus and our challenges in the 21st century. And by the way, I started at the age of 9. I got involved in the Democratic Party when Dr. King was assassinated. And although I was not eligible to vote, I still went out there door to door because the candidate I worked for believed that we could get a playground in my neighborhood. I'm still a Democrat because I believe that this party represents our values and the value system that my parents and my grandparents and others believed in as Americans. And I am a fifth-generation American. We trace our roots to the Jamestown Society. So next year we celebrate our 400th anniversary in this great country. And as a Democrat, I'm proud to be an American, but I'm also proud to be a champion for inclusion and justice and equality for all. And thank you for speaking to me again. And if you ever have my gumbo, we'll never get into a disagreement.
After hearing that, thank you. Donna, after hearing that answer, I wonder if we should add Donna Brazile to the 2020 list of possible candidates. But anyway, I wanted to just, we're going to close up the conference right now, but please welcome back Larry Sabato.
Well done.
As we expected, they did a terrific job. We learned a lot. We want some of the gumbo. I want it to be vegetarian, at least my portion of it, okay? Because that's the way I am. But thank you all for the great job that you did. Bob, we knew, I don't know how we knew, but we thought you'd be a good host of a panel like this. People tell me you've had experience. Nonetheless, I wanted you to know we are permanently adopting your one-sentence rule, and we're calling it the Bob Costa rule of questions. There will be no payment. It's just the honor of having your name attached to this permanent rule. But thank you all very, very much. Thank you for coming and joining us for our 20th anniversary. And we'll be back again next year if the creeks don't rise. And what's the other part of that? If the something about the creeks don't rise and the something, something, something. Virginia's not Southern anymore. So, you know, we don't remember phrases like that. But thank you all very much. Take care.
Thanks, Juleanna. Take care.